my dreams. I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people up the red, bottom blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life, make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger.
Independent journalist, also a writer for Consortium News. Of course, it's one day after the arrest of Julian Assange, the shocking arrest. Not that we weren't expecting that this could happen someday, but the video of him coming out was deeply disturbing to all of us here who have been doing these vigils for some time now. So we're going to resume basically the vigil that we started yesterday. It went on for, I believe, at least 6 hours. And we had a number of guests yesterday, Kim.com, Chris Hedges, a whole bunch of excellent guests. And we've got more excellent guests lined up to carry on with our vigil today. And we're going to look at the latest news. As you can imagine, the news is developing all the time. So there's more things to talk about than from yesterday. I want to start with an editorial that the New York Times wrote about Julian's arrest. And we're going to have on later Francis Boyle, an international lawyer who's an expert in the extradition treaty with the U.S., to talk about that in particular. And he pointed out something that he believes they had wrong in this editorial, but there's even maybe a bigger point on the larger issue of press freedom that the Times says here that was also challenged by Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept. Essentially, the way the Times and the other mainstream media responded was, with a sigh of relief that somehow this indictment, which was narrowly focused on an apparent hack, is what the Justice Department release called it. In other words, an attempt by Julian to assist in the stealing of the documents by Chelsea Manning. that's, as the New York Times says, we don't do that kind of thing. That journalists don't do that. This is that makes him, he didn't act as a journalist there, acting as a thief, and that's why this is a legitimate indictment. In fact, as Glenn Greenwald will point out, that's not what it was. It was not a hack. He was not involved in a hack, and he was doing something that journalists do involve in every day. But let me get to the New York Times editorial first, and then Greenwald's response. The editorial board, this was an editorial board editorial, says, quote, "The United States charging Mr. Assange with conspiring to hack a government computer." I guess that's their headline. The single charge is straightforward. It alleges that Mr. Assange helped the Army private break into a government computer in 2010 to steal classified and sensitive documents. Helped her to break into a government computer. The administration has begun well by charging Mr. Assange with an indisputable crime. But there is always a risk with this administration, and here the Times wants it both ways. This administration, one that labels the free press as the enemy of the people, that the prosecution of Mr. Assange could become an assault on the First Amendment and whistleblowers. I mean, if additional charges are added, which the Department of Justice yesterday said it would. So they're calling it a hack, the New York Times, that Assange helped Manning to steal these documents. And then they say, right now it's a crime, but Trump might go over the line. But he didn't in this indictment. Because he didn't indict him on the Espionage Act, where it clearly states that anyone who possesses classified information who is not authorized to and then also disseminates it can be prosecuted on the Espionage Act. But that would clearly include Assange because he possessed classified material and he published it. Anybody who retweets any document would be liable to act under that language. None of us are authorized to have classified information. The government continues to consider classified even when it's public. Well, the Times is saying, okay, let's get him on this, but we're in the clear right now. Now, Greenwald, in a piece in The Intercept, counters by saying the key fact being widely misreported is that the indictment accuses Assange of trying to help Manning obtain access to the document databases to which she had no valid access, i.e. hacking rather than journalism. But the indictment alleges no such thing. Rather, it simply accuses Assange of trying to help Manning log into the Defense Department's computers using a different username so that she could maintain her anonymity while downloading documents of public interest and then furnish them to WikiLeaks to publish. In other words, Greenwald goes on, the indictment seeks to criminalize what journalists are not only permitted, but ethically required to do, take steps to help their sources maintain their anonymity. As longtime Assange lawyer Barry Pollock put it, quote, the factual allegations boil down to encouraging a source to provide him information and taking efforts to protect the identity of that source. Journalists around the world should be deeply troubled by these unprecedented criminal charges. Greenwald then says that's why the indictment poses such a grave threat to press freedom. It characterizes as a felony many actions that journalists are not just permitted but required to take in order to conduct sensitive reporting in the digital age. So I didn't understand this individually yesterday. I don't think any of us there had actually read the indictment in detail. There was a Justice Department release to call it a hack, but the indictment never mentions the word hack. And what he's being accused of is protecting the identity of the source. In other words, she had legal access to these documents. She had clearance, but she didn't want to log in under her own name, obviously. So that's what Assange allegedly was helping her to do, to log in under a different ID so that her identity could be protected. That is not a hack, and that's not stealing the documents either. That's protecting the source. So the New York Times shouldn't be breathing such a sigh of relief. This indictment, according to what Greenwald is saying, also endangers journalism and press freedom. Elizabeth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really definitely very concerning. And first of all, just want to apologize for any sound of mowing that may come through as I'm reading this. But the next piece we have to look at is regarding Mairead Maguire, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name, requested the UK Home Office, permission from the UK Home Office to visit Julian Assange, whom this year she has nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And then I'm going to read a quote from her that I think is really valuable. It says, quote, and this is may read, talking. She says, quote, "I want to visit Julian to see if he is receiving medical care and to let him know that there are many people around the world who admire him and are grateful for his courage in trying to stop the wars and end the suffering of others." Maguire said. Thursday, 11th of April, will go down in history as a dark day for the rights of humanity when Julian Assange, a brave and good man, was arrested by British Metropolitan Police, forcibly removed without prior warning in a style benefiting a war criminal from the Ecuadorian embassy and bundled into a police van. It is a sad time when the UK government, at the behest of the United States government, arrested Julian Assange, a symbol of freedom of speech, as the publisher of WikiLeaks, and the world's leaders and mainstream media remain silent on the fact that he is an innocent man until proven guilty, while the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention defines him as innocent. The decision of President Lenin Moreno of Ecuador, who under financial pressure from the United States has withdrawn asylum from the WikiLeaks founder, is a further example of the US's global currency monopoly, pressurizing other countries to do their bidding or face the financial and possibly violent consequences for disobedience to the alleged world superpower, which has sadly lost its moral compass. Julian Assange has taken asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy 7 years ago, precisely because he foresaw that the US would demand his extradition to face a grand jury in the US for mass murders carried out not by him, but by US and NATO forces and concealed from the public. Unfortunately, it is my belief that Julian Assange will not see a fair trial. As we have seen over the last 7 years, time and again, the European countries and many others do not have the political will or clout to stand up for what they know is right and will eventually cave into the United States' will. We have watched Chelsea Manning return to jail and solitary confinement, so we must not be naive in our thinking. Surely this is the future for Julian Assange. And she continues saying, quote, "I visited Julian on 2 occasions in the Ecuadorian embassy and was very impressed with this courageous and highly intelligent man. The first visit was on my return from Kabul, where young Afghan teenage boys insisted on writing a letter with the request that I carry it to Julian Assange to thank him for publishing on WikiLeaks the truth about the war in Afghanistan and to help stop their homeland being bombed by planes and drones. All had a story of brothers or friends killed by drones while collecting wood in winter on the mountains." She continues, saying, I nominated Julian Assange on the 8th of January 2019 for the Nobel Peace Prize. I issued a press release hoping to bring attention to his nomination, which seemed to have been widely ignored by Western media. By Julian's courageous actions and others like him, we could see full well the atrocities of war. The release of the files brought to our doors the atrocities of our governments carried out through media. It is my strong belief that this is the true essence of an activist, and it's my great shame I live in an era where people like Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and anyone willing to open our eyes to the atrocities of war is likely to be hunted like an animal by governments, punished and silenced. Therefore, I believe the British government should oppose the extradition of Assange as it sets a dangerous precedent for journalists, whistleblowers, and other sources of truth the US may wish to pressure in the future. This man is paying a high price to end war and for peace and nonviolence, and we should all remember that. And that was the end of the really amazing quote.
Powerful statement. Powerful statement from Reed Maguire.
Absolutely.
Yesterday on the vigil, the emergency vigil, there was someone, I don't remember who, mentioned that Sweden had reopened the investigation that they had closed into Assange on the sexual assault allegations. That was, of course, the reason why Julian went into the embassy back in June of 2012, rather, because he correctly, as it turns out, as the whole world knows now, understood that if he were to be taken into custody by the British police for this, he could be and sent and extradited to Sweden, and he could be extradited in turn back to the US. That's why he sought refuge. So yesterday, in fact, what happened was one of the plaintiffs, Anne Arden, her name is, asked that the investigation be reopened, and Swedish authorities said that they are considering doing that. And we speculated yesterday that the reason that Sweden might want to do this is because a extradition from Sweden to the United States apparently is a lot easier legally than the U.S.-British extradition treaty, which we will spoil about a little bit later. And that if the British run into some trouble, and the Americans in the British courts, that they could have him maybe sent to Sweden and then sent to the. This is pure speculation, but that I just wanted to correct the record on that, and we should keep our eyes on that story for sure.
Yeah, no doubt whatsoever. It's really important to watch for any propaganda narratives that become a favorite in the media for deflecting from the real issue at hand regarding Assange's status as a political prisoner and not a criminal. So we also have a tweet that I'd like to read from Mark Curtis that said, quote, "Trump seeks to prosecute a non-US publisher in Europe under US laws. Amazing imperial arrogance. If the UK government and journalists allow him to succeed, maybe Moscow or Riyadh will prosecute UK journalists for revealing secrets about them. That's the precedent we face." And I think that's a really punch in the gut, powerful tweet from Mark.
No kidding. Well, the reactions keep pouring in, of course, and we can only mention a few of them. Noam Chomsky said on Democracy Now! That the arrest this morning, Friday, that the arrest of Assange is scandalous. And he says it highlights the shocking extraterritorial reach of the US. Same point Mark Curtis was making. Then there's this tweet from not from Rafael. Well, we had Rafael Correa, by the way, announced and confirmed that his Facebook page was taken down yesterday. Interesting. Ricardo Patiño is a former foreign minister of Ecuador, said, "World shame. Lenin," that's Lenin Moreno, "took his betrayal to a global extent. He authorized the arrest of Assange in our embassy in London. He violated the Constitution, the international agreements, and put at risk the life of a journalist that revealed atrocious crimes. We condemn you, Judas." Now, Daniel McAdams, who's with us patiently, is going to join us, and we're very happy to have him. Yesterday, he wrote, quote, "You are no doubt hearing quite a bit today about the arrest and likely extradition of WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, who was literally sold out for the proverbial 30 pieces of silver, or in this case, a $4.2 billion IMF loan to Ecuador, approved just last month by Vice President Mike Pence, who was in Ecuador in June to push a quid pro quo with the then recently elected President Moreno. He told Moreno, you hand us Assange, we'll make sure you get your loan. And that's what happened, of course. We're waiting for Francis Boyle. So in the meantime, let us bring in Daniel McAdams. Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. You've been a guest before in the vigil when we were all worried that yesterday would come, and it has come now.
Mel, thanks for having me, Joe. I really appreciate what you guys are all doing. Susie and everyone, you're doing tremendous work, and I just admire you so much.
Well, tell us, what was your reaction when you saw the video?
Well,
Media reaction.
Dr. Paul and I do a daily Ron Paul Liberty Report, and we were all set to revisit Libya probably for the 100th time as things were heating up. And I got out of bed and got an email from Dr. Paul saying, "I assume you want to change the topic for today," and included a link. And I hit the link and just, fell apart. I mean, I probably had a few expletives that I uttered. But then when I looked at the video, Joe, I was genuinely shocked. I mean, this vibrant person we remember even after a few years in the embassy, still a vibrant person. The person that we saw dragged out of that embassy was not at all what I was expecting to see. How pasty he looked, how unhealthy, how yellow. Obviously, a person with serious medical issues. It just really speaks poorly to certainly the current government in Ecuador to let this journalist sink to such bad health. It's awful, terrible.
What are the larger issues involved here, Dan, as you see it?
Well, I like the...
And then even in this, beyond the important ones you just mentioned about Julian's health.
Yeah, well, I think you started it out perfectly with the New York Times thing, because this is classic. I mean, I think this is kind of like it'll be like a high-tech show trial. And I said on our show that it's going to be a show trial. I've written last night that I think it's going to be a show trial. It's a high-tech show trial. It won't be like something we saw in the 30s. And we're already starting to see that in motion with the New York Times, the voice of the establishment, saying an indisputable crime. They're all piling on because they all hate his guts. They all would like to see him, to be honest, in a cell or better, probably dead. And why? Because he has integrity they don't have. He does the work they don't do. There are very few journalists and publishers that have the courage to do what he's done. So we're seeing that. I've also noticed, and I predicted, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I predicted you're going to start seeing assaults on his character. And that's how you're going to turn people against him. And it's not necessarily going to turn fans into hating him. But I think what the goal is basically is to get people who are very much on his side, very pro him, to just kind of quiet down a little bit, not be so vocal. And they're doing things like, I saw at least 3 salacious stories this morning about his personal habits, trying to make him seem repulsive, trying to, absolutely irrelevant to the charges or anything else, but just trying to plant the seed. There's something wrong with this guy. There's something unpleasant about this guy. You shouldn't embrace him. And I think we're going to see that ramp up. There's going to be other salacious details released, and the media will pounce on it. Maybe some financial things they'll cook up and make him look bad. I think this is the softening up in the public's mind, this kind of a show trial to make an example of him. Has nothing to do with justice for Assange. It has to do with, as I said in my piece, pour encourager les autres, to give the others a warning. Don't dare be an Assange. Don't even think about it.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point about the fact that the narratives now are trying to smear Assange's character and personality. And that's exactly what we also saw shortly after the U.S. Department of State's indictment, the sealed indictment, was revealed to exist late last year. So I think that, as Craig Murray wrote before Assange was arrested, he said the job of the media and, I would add supporters is to combat those narratives. We can't, go into a UK prison and bring Assange out, but what we can do is we can fight back against those propaganda narratives. So do you have any thoughts for our viewers and listeners about how they can best do that? How can they go about kind of fighting back against those smears?
Well, I have to add a funny note, if I may. Yeah. The U.S. government is participating in an international conference for the safety of journalists today. So, I mean, hypocrisy just knows no ends when it comes to the State Department. Mark Toner, who used to be the spokesperson, is still in the State Department, tweeted out today how proud he was to participate, even as the U.S. is persecuting a journalist. But what I was concerned about, Susan, what I've noticed is really, aside from Tulsi Gabbard, I have not seen any full-throated or even half-throated or even quarter-throated defenses of the First Amendment in the U.S. and of Julian Assange. I think Tulsi did a great job, but there's been a lot of silence. And I remember back in 2010 and 2011, when WikiLeaks was big news and they were releasing all this important information. In fact, I was just watching a floor speech that Dr. Paul gave, a 5-minute floor speech defending WikiLeaks, defending Julian Assange, raising the importance of knowing what our governments are doing in our name, the killing they're doing overseas. And so far, I'm pretty disappointed that we're not seeing that. But as a long way around to answer your question, I don't feel it's hopeless, though. I think we do have a chance to influence our representatives here in the U.S., maybe even the president, who's had a fit of amnesia yesterday for some reason or other. He's forgotten that there was such a thing called WikiLeaks after repeating how much he loved it about 500 times. But I think we can contact our representatives. I think we can talk to each other. The word narrative is such an important word. Don't let them shift the narrative to where Assange is being made to look creepy or something's wrong with him. We've got to stay on target. We've got to talk to people, contact people respectfully, talk to our representatives, express concerns about how the Constitution may be being abused right now for political purposes by both political parties. This is the real problem. It's a perfect storm because both parties want to see him in the slammer, and that's a real problem for us.
No kidding. When you said only Tulsi Gabbard was the only one who spoke out, and Mark Toner says what he said, it's the entire establishment. Everyone has a stake in it that is afraid of the kinds of information that WikiLeaks puts out and that Assange, that he's created. So they see it as personal survival, maybe, to their careers, to their advancement, to stop this guy from doing what journalists are supposed to be doing, not the co-opted journalists of the corporate media. And as far as the bipartisan issue goes of the establishment, the queen of the establishment on the Democratic side, I left her out, but I can't resist. Hillary Clinton last night was at an event in New York, and she said that Assange must answer for what he's done. And she also said, I think it is clear from the indictment that came out, it's not about punishing journalism. Another defender of journalism, Daniel. Just disgusting. Michel Quilon is in Brussels, I believe, and I don't want to have him. Dana, can you hold on for another few minutes? Can you stay with us? I see Francis Boyle has joined us as well, but I want to give 2 minutes to Michel to tell us your views. Michel, tell us about your your background and your reaction to the Assange arrest yesterday.
Well, do you hear me okay?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well. I'm a journalist, independent writer. My topic is analysis of war and media lies. I developed the concept of the principles of propaganda war from Iraq 91, Yugoslavia, Libya, Syria, and also undeclared wars. We have a webpage and we are editing books. I'm a good friend of Victor Dedache from Paris, and I think you had him in this meeting previously. I know they organized a goods demonstration in Paris last week, and they planned another one for tomorrow against in front of Le Monde, the famous newspaper who betrayed Assange. And in Brussels, we have a demonstration on Monday in front of the British Embassy, near the European Union. And I started an appeal in December. We organized a debate here about Assange with Rafael Correa, who is living in Belgium, and I'm in contact with him. And Victor Dedache came from Paris, and myself. And we made an appeal to organize a committee here in Belgium. I was informed that I could not participate myself for special reasons, but there is a small committee, and they are organizing this demonstration on Monday. I would have a suggestion as a publishing house. I think it would be interesting to prepare a book internationally very quickly, made by several interviews of some of the people who have been participating here, and make rather fast some interviews. Each person very short, 5-6 questions on a specific aspect of the book, of the situation. I made a list. And then if we can cooperate, we can make it fast and make it simultaneously in several languages. We can take care for French and Spanish. I can have partners to make it in Dutch. And I guess it would be possible to find other languages. And making a book is big work if it is seriously, but if we cooperate internationally and divide the work, it could be fast, I guess. I don't hear you.
Michel, I know that it's late in Brussels. Sorry to interrupt you. We have a guest here that has to leave us in 25 minutes. Will you be able to stick around for another half an hour and then rejoin us? I'm sorry to cut you off, but we only have a limited time with Francis Boyle. Francis, can you hear us? Francis? Is Francis unmuted? Can you unmute
yes,
Francis?
He's not muted. Francis, you may have to. He may have to check his audio. Okay. While we have this issue, Michel, can you describe more how you think we could put together a book? I think that's a fantastic idea, and it's an original one.
Well, I made a book 8 years ago following this method. The book was called in French, Israël, parlons-en. Let's talk about Israel. And I realized 20 interviews with Noam Chomsky, Samir Amin, and several specialists from USA, from Europe, some Jewish historians too, some Muslim persons. And each person in 4, 5, 6 pages was analyzing one topic in the history, in the economy, in the strategy, media, apartheid, solutions, and so on. So, of course, here it's a bit different, but I think with I can make a list and send it to you. Because I discussed this project already with Victor. I have a special show each week on Tuesday, and he was invited about Assange 2 months ago. And I discussed this proposal with him. So the list of the topic is not complicated. It's all the big questions. Is Assange a thief? He is guilty of rape and all the usual things. And then behind that, explaining what it is about, freedom of information, and so on. If we could have a short interview with Noam Chomsky, that would be a great help. And I mean, this is something I've been doing already, 2 books in this style, and it gets very fast because you don't need to look and to investigate in things. You just pick the persons who know very well about this topic. You make an interview by Skype or anything else, or by mail, and then you just organize it. Can be fast.
Absolutely. I think that's a really fantastic idea. It's something we should definitely explore. Now, I've been going back and forth with Francis, who says he can hear us. Can you hear us, Francis?
Yes.
Perfect. There you are. Thank you for joining us and taking the time to speak with us.
Francis, can you hear me?
Yeah, your audio is now cut out again. It's not on the Zoom.
I don't think it was ever on. I think that was Michelle saying that he could hear.
Okay.
Francis has to adjust his audio. I've sent him a message, but I don't know if he's read it. Did you connect with him?
I tried to, yes. I'm going to write a little bit more. If you can just continue talking with Daniel and Michelle, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, Michelle, tell us about what your views are of the extradition proceedings. That's what we're going to talk to Francis about. Do you have any ideas about?
Well, you will not learn something special from me. Just a shame. It's violating all the rules of international law, and it's pure arbitrary of the empire. It's really a scandal. And with Victor in this show we made, I can send to you the link for those who can understand French. It was very clear. It's really an intimidation, and everybody now who is making an alert is in danger. We have other examples. Julian Assange is the most famous and the most extreme way of handling, but it's a general system. I think we are living now a new McCarthyism, actually, and in Europe we feel the same. It is completely forbidden to debate about war, and people like me and others are completely excluded from televisions. It's 4 years that I've been in television in France or in Belgium, and other people like that. So it's really the coming back of a new McCarthyism. And I think behind Assange, we have to show the global dimension of this attack. I don't know if you hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. No, I think that's great. So what was your initial reaction when you saw the video yesterday of Assange being dragged from the embassy?
I didn't see the video because I was in the train and I was preparing for a debate in France, in Lyon. So I got just a message on my telephone from Victor Dedage, and so on. I took it afterwards. It's a scandal. It's really, they prepare Guantanamo.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we had psychologist Lissa Johnson write a series of articles that described not only, the role of psychologists in developing the US torture program, but also the types of torture that were used against the detainees. And I know that yesterday, journalist, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges described the fact that he believed Assange will basically be disappeared into the same system that those detainees went into. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or Daniel, if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, we haven't heard heard much from the Scripples lately, have we? It's funny how you can disappear when the state wants you to.
Very much.
Excuse me, but we had we do a Washington conference every summer, and in 2017 we had a terrific presentation, a live tie-in from Julian Assange, and he gave a great talk, but sort of in retrospect, sort of a prescient warning, because he talked about Mike Pence, who was obsessed with Assange. He's obsessed with WikiLeaks, and he called him a non-state hostile intelligence service with ties to Russia in a rabid, frothing at the mouth speech he gave while CIA director when he was at CSIS. And he said at the time, "This will stop." He called it an assault on our Constitution, I think, which tells you a lot about where this individual's head is. He views journalism, which challenges the state, which is what good journalism does, as an assault on the Constitution. If that is not a fascist, a totalitarian mentality, to have someone in charge of our diplomacy with that kind of worldview, Elizabeth, this is really terrifying.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And I think it's really horrendous that so many politicians, as you mentioned earlier, have not commented and spoken out on this. Now, a number, as you say, Tulsi Gabbard has. I know Jill Stein was vocal about the issue yesterday. We've had a number of politicians, come out against this, including Mike Gravel, who was on the vigil just a few days ago. But that's not enough. And that's very, very little in comparison with the number of people that we would ideally expect to be speaking out loudly on this subject.
Yeah, it's disappointing. Someone like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has a huge platform at this point, and she, in my opinion, gave a pretty mealy-mouthed semi-defense of the whole thing, as did, by the way, the Committee to Protect Journalists. I don't know if you saw their statement, but it was something like, "We're keeping an eye on this to see if there are any crimes committed." So yeah, good job, guys. We're proud of you there.
Yeah, I remember I was going through all of the different organizations, whether it's humanitarian organizations, free speech organizations, protecting journalists, that type of thing. A number of their statements were particularly mealy-mouthed, as you say. I think one was basically, "We're troubled by the situation." And I think it's a lot more than troubling.
I'll tell you, someone who wasn't mealy-mouthed was Senator Manchin from West Virginia. He's our property now. I put up an article on our page, and as a picture, I used him with a shotgun, because that really is what it sounded like. I mean, especially a senator from a former slave state to say that. Talk about I don't know.
That was the worst, Daniel. That was the absolute worst, that comment, that he's our property. But it shows you the mindset here. That and Pompeo, it is totalitarian. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. I just wanted to inform everyone that I spoke with Francis on the phone, and he was unable to correct the problem. We don't really know what the problem is. We thought maybe it was his audio setting, so he's had to go. So I'm going to do a Skype interview taped with him over the next few days. Not that this extradition issue is going to be cleared up anytime soon. It'll be a year or more. So I think next week we'll have an audio taped interview with Francis about this issue, about how Britain and the U.S. could get around this requirement that that the act has to be a crime in both countries for an extradition to take place. But I won't say any more because I don't understand that stuff, certainly not like he does. But Daniel, that comment and the defense, you talked about the defense, someone who said that it was an affront to truth what Assange has done. If that's not projection, what these people are doing. The defense secretary of Britain, I was trying to look for the exact quote and I can't find it.
Oh, yeah.
Said something yesterday. You don't remember that? He said the same
No
kind
one's
of thing.
above law. No, something like that. It was, awful.
Yeah, no one is against the law and above the law except us. And that he doesn't speak the truth. He's spoken lies. And then, of course, the judge in his hearing yesterday about the bail conditions being violated called him a narcissist.
Shocking.
This is like, I thought a judge is supposed to determine the law and then pronounce sentences. All right, that's the role I thought the judge had, not to condemn a suspect. Well, he was guilty, I suppose. I see. So it was after his statement, I guess, came after he was pronounced guilty of this violation of the bail conditions, and then he had to toss in there that he was a narcissist, a man who's given up so much to help the rest of the world. That's not my definition of narcissism.
Yeah. One thing that's encouraging, we're trying to grasp at straws, and I remember, and I don't know if it's been renewed, but I remember Senator Paul from Kentucky, he had a proposal a while ago to offer Assange complete immunity in exchange for a testimony to Congress. I think that might actually turn out to be interesting because I think Assange probably has a lot to say, and if he were really granted immunity from current and any future prosecution for what he would have to say, I think a lot of dirty laundry might be aired. I don't know. That seems maybe potentially a way out of this mess. I don't think Trump's going to say, "Hey, you're totally pardoned." I just don't see it happening, especially after his amnesia of yesterday. But if this might be some sort of a compromise, it could be a good outcome.
On the contrary, the New York Times editorial also said that he might provide valuable information about how Russia was able to transfer the files to WikiLeaks. Now, I mean, have they not seen his denials about this? And there was also that deal where he was supposed to come and testify. Scott Horton was talking about it in detail yesterday on our vigil, that he was going to come and get some kind of immunity to discuss this. And it was all screwed up by someone who talked about it. And Senator Warner found out about it. And then he said, you'll be arrested and in jail too before you'll testify about this, something to that effect. So the idea that, I mean, as you just pointed out, Dana, we would welcome, I'm sure Julian would welcome the chance to give technical evidence that it was in Russia. And one thinks that had something to do with what the VIPs have come up with, that this was a leak and not a hack.
In fact, speaking of VIPs, I just got an email from my good friend Phil Giraldi, who sent me the outrage of the day, as long as we're on about Russia, because this is the obsession. The obsession is still, even with Russiagate, the hoax disproven, they seem to double down. Here's a bill that was just introduced yesterday, S-1189, a bill to require the Secretary of State to determine whether the Russian Federation should be designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. So, talk about doubling down on idiocy. So I don't think the mania is going to be cured anytime soon. So yeah, thanks, Joe, for pouring some cold water on my little bit of hope that there might be a deal. But I think, unfortunately, you're probably right.
No, I mean, the new Cold War will not end even with Miller's report that there was no collusion. They're just ignoring this. They won't adjust their course because it's been all about stopping WikiLeaks and getting at Russia, which was a long-standing geopolitical aim of the United States, predating the 2016 election, predating even as soon as Putin came in power, really no longer wanted to play ball like Yeltsin did. The Democratic candidates are going to use Russia as well. And I was thinking about that. Why? Because they don't have anything to run on. Anything else serious to run on? The only two candidates maybe, and I have my issues with them, as many of us do. Warren, is he's going to run on big banks and trying to break that up and against Wall Street. And Bernie's got his issue of universal health care and other issues. They may not need Russia as much as the others. When you think of the other candidates, they're just empty suits, all of them, and they're going to pound Russia away.
Except Tulsi Gabbard, we have to remember.
Except Tulsi.
Very solid. Very solid on this. A couple of missteps, I mean, let's be honest, but otherwise, pretty solid.
Oh, she's the best on foreign policy without any question. The only one willing to stand up and accuse the U.S. of doing what they're doing, which is regime change. And she's a real problem for the establishment. For her to be going out there on the debate stage, she just qualified yesterday. Yes. For to get on the debate stage. If she starts saying stuff like that, you're going to see Brian Williams saying, well, thank you very much, Representative Gabbard. After 30 seconds, let's go on to a question to Kamala Harris.
No, there'll be some technical problems with her microphone.
That might happen if necessary.
You can't get it to work.
Yeah, maybe some interfere with France. No, I'm joking. No, this is Russia is going to remain. And now that they've got Assange, we cannot tamp down the continued belief that his arrest had something to do with the 2016 election, right?
And even putting Russiagate aside for a moment, as Daniel says, the amount of dirty laundry that Assange could expose may actually serve against him receiving any type of immunity, just as the huge amount of what we would assume dirty laundry was held by people like the Awan brothers, and instead of prosecuting them for their actions, the Department of Justice backed off and declined to prosecute. So I think that, unfortunately, in a sane world, it would granted him immunity, but in the real world that we live in, I think it works against that. But that's just a side comment.
I think you're right, Elizabeth. And the interesting thing that came out in the summary of the Mueller report, which we haven't seen, of course, but everything hinges on this one thing, which is this insane intelligence community assessment, which doesn't exist, is a product that doesn't exist in the intelligence community, that was cooked up by Brennan with, quote, hand-picked analysts. It was admitted. This is the cockamamie thing. He got together a few people who agreed with him and put this together. Even the NSA said only moderate, and remember the disclaimer at the beginning of the report, all this stuff could possibly be totally fake. However, check this out. And by the way, here's 20 pages on how horrible RT is. Everything hinges on this flimsy. And if you talk to anyone in the intelligence community, I'm sure both of you guys have, they'll tell you this is the craziest thing you can imagine.
Michel, back in Brussels, can you talk a little bit about the larger issues of press freedom in this case, in the Assange case? You're a writer. What does this mean that the U.S. government can arrest a publisher like this?
Well, I think it is forbidden now to expose the real reasons of war. It is forbidden now to expose to a large audience that it is based on lies and crimes, and everybody is under threat. I have a certain audience in the French-speaking public, especially the youth, because of some books and some video, and because I was in a TV show in France who was very popular a few years ago and then was forbidden. And there is really a harassment. If you look at my Wikipedia biography, I'm a monster. And if one friend tries to correct this in the minute, it is suppressed. And there has been a huge campaign against me. I am a fascist, anti-Semite, friend of dictators, and of course conspirationist. And if you look at Google, they organize it really in a massive way. And since I have published that book I spoke about Israel, and since I am active in the boycott, disinvestments, and sanctions, and I have organized in Brussels in February, I think, in December last year, in March last year. I have organized a big event with exchange of experience from 20 persons from 6 European countries. And the pressure was terrible. And I've been attacked as anti-Semite. And also, as a small publisher, we were invited in the book fair, French-speaking, in Beirut, in Lebanon. And since we are poor, of course, it was organized through an official organism who can bring the books and represent all the small publishers. And on the last day, we were informed by the Ministry of Culture that it was forbidden and that the books would not be there, that the conference I had with George Combe in Lebanon would be just cancelled and everything. And my colleague Federica was already in Beirut, so I went there. And now I'm in court about this. And this shows to you it's really forbidden to speak about war and about the real things behind the war. And well, we try to explain really the situation about that. Yes, later I will show you a book I published because since we are so accused of conspiracy theory, my last book was in English you would call that USA, the 100 most awful quotations. In French, les 100 pires citations, and I made a book based only on quotations by US presidents, ministers, and strategists and generals. The quotation and then the context since 41 and of course more recently. And well, it's forbidden to speak about it on television. You can sell it very well on internet. You can have a few debates, but there is, as I told, a real McCarthyism, and I'm not the only one. Really, it's a big organized campaign. I made a video called How Israel Manipulates Internet and the Opinion, because there is a Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Tel Aviv with hundreds of soldiers and students who is watching and controlling what happens on internet and organize immediately the offensive to put you in discredit and to bring you in trouble and problems. So I think I have a personal experience, and my experience is small. I'm not in prison. I'm not. But you have other cases of people who had to stop their work, their blog. Other people have been in prison also in Europe, and I think it's a general trend since they are in crisis, and since, you know, here in Europe, a lot of people, especially in the youth, don't trust the media anymore. And the monopoly is finished. And of course, on internet, they can find good things and also bad things. They can find really conspiracy theories, and then it's a dead end. But I think you have to put this Assange affair in relation with the media crisis and the political parties crisis. You can see in Europe that all the traditional parties, Christian liberals and so-called socialists, are in deep crisis and they are declining. So you have mainly new parties who are right nationalistic and some going in the direction of fascism. A few of them are left and radicals, but this proves that the people are looking for something, are searching, and they distrust the elections, they distrust the media. So my interpretation of this aggressivity is that they are afraid that they lose the control on the opinion, because being called a journalist is nearly an insult here in France and in Belgium and so on. So I think it has to be, it's a very broad case. It's a symbol of the question of freedom of expression. And yeah, sorry.
Do you think that this 30 years ago or 40 years ago, you were faced with the same type of restrictions?
Well, in France and Belgium, I've seen it worsening, because my first book called Attention Média, Beware of the Media, in 91, I had some minority reports in the Belgian radio and television, and now it's forbidden. And I think, yes, the aggressivity, the campaign of demonization, labeling people who are against war as fascist and anti-Semite and friends of dictators, and also meaning that you are paid by dictators and so on. Yes, that has been really a crescendo in the last 10 years.
So what does the arrest of a journalist and a publisher, where does that take us? We've reached a new point here, haven't we?
Well, it's you told it, and we think it also. It's warning. Really, don't try to do as Assange. And we have other people who have been arrested here. For example, a few years ago, 10 years ago, a very courageous French journalist, Denis Robert, explained a scandal, to make it short, with Clearstream, who is a big company organizing the exchanges between banks. And he showed with documents that they were cheating and that they were just smuggling black money from drugs and so on, the respectable banks. Well, he has been sued in court. He has been arrested and he had trials for 10 years, all his money, all his energy. And in that time, he could not do his job of investigation, only defend himself. So, and finally he won, but he lost 10 years of his life and he was very discouraged. So it's really a harassment. I think we should do something collectively, and maybe if we can do that book, one chapter should be devoted to this aspect. Not only Assange, but others are being harassed or in danger. So Assange is really the symbol of the freedom of information, freedom of real journalism.
Absolutely, and I think that likewise, you know, the way that I've reacted to the prosecution of Assange this entire time, and I know that others have as well, is that the prosecution of Assange is the prosecution of a free press, because he is that symbol and represents more than just himself as an individual journalist. So, absolutely, Joe. I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, see, they're trying to a sleight of hand here to make us think that this was not about publishing. This is not about, as Hillary Clinton told us. So I guess we got to believe it if she told us that this is not about journalism and publishing. It's about him trying to steal the documents. And then it turns out somebody like Glenn Greenwald actually read the damn indictment carefully, shows that it's not that at all. It's that he was simply trying to protect the identity of his source, which is kind of ironic because Intercept has gotten into a little bit of trouble by mistakenly revealing the identity of a couple of their sources. They got burnt for that. But he's right, Greenwald. He wasn't involved in even those stories, as far as I know. He is right that is something that journalists are bound to do. The reason you do it is not just for ethical reasons that you want to protect that person. It's because if you start giving up your sources, nobody's going to talk to you anymore. You're out of business. You got to be able to prove your credibility to people that you can keep your word, that you're not going to spill the beans about who talked to you. So that's why some journalists go to jail in contempt of court when they refuse to testify in a court to give up their source. Tell the police or the FBI or whatever who the source was. They will go to jail for that, and that's not because they're such great heroes, or because they're out of business if they start yielding to the pressure of the state to give up a source. And that's all that Assange was doing here. He was trying to protect Chelsea Manning, and they've cooked up this thing. And that misleading press release is just so disturbing to me. Not that hasn't happened before, but it's typical of how the Department of Justice works. They know that the public will not read that indictment. They know that a lot of journalists won't read the indictment. They're just going to read off the press release, which came out before the indictment, I believe. And that's all that I had seen, too, by the time of yesterday's vigil. So I was under this impression that he was accused of hacking. But then think about it. She had legal access to these documents. She'd seen them.
Exactly.
That's how she knew about it. Right? Absolutely. So this was not a hack. She was allowed to see the way Pentagon. I mean, Dan Ellsberg was right. He was one of the writers of the Pentagon Papers. One of the many team of writers who put the Pentagon Papers together. So obviously he had legal access. He would lock it into his drawer. He had a safe combination drawer. And every night when he went home, he had to put it in the safe. So one night he decided to start photocopying them. So he had legal access to them, but he did not have the legal right to give them to the New York Times. Just like Chelsea didn't have the legal right, yes, to give them. Technically and legally speaking, should not have given them to WikiLeaks. She tried to give them to the Times and the Post. They turned it down. But she had the legal access to them, so she did not need a password to get in. She needed her identity. This is a very weak case they've got. And there are going to be more charges. And unfortunately, we couldn't talk to Francis today about whether they have to come up with those charges right away so that the British government can extradite him and he could be charged on the same charges that he was being extradited for, or whether they can get around this and add more charge. Francis's argument is, and I've read a little bit of what he wrote about this, that once he gets to the U.S., they'll be able to get around this and put as many more charges they want on him as possible. That's what Kim.com was saying yesterday, that he expected many charges, and the DOJ said, indeed, there would be more charges.
Absolutely. And I think I just want to add to that a tweet from yesterday from attorney Jay Lederman that I noticed that goes to that subject about adding more charges. He let me just grab his tweet really fast. He basically said that Assange may face the death penalty if extradited, despite the U.S. guarantees to the contrary. He said the U.S. is only charged with him with, quote, computer hacking for now. And obviously that's incorrect, as Joe was just explaining. But Jay went on to say that as soon as Assange gets to U.S. soil, they'll likely file additional charges and he could easily face the death penalty, and that this initial charge is for, quote, subterfuge and extradition only. So like you said, Joe, it will be nice to speak with Francis about that and kind of clarify the issue.
Yeah, exactly, to see whether indeed the U.S. has to first level these new charges before the extradition, or whether they can wait and get him back. Our assumption yesterday was, because I wasn't aware of this technicality, that they could just, and Kim.com was saying that there would be more charges once they got to the U.S. But the Times is saying that is not the case. And Francis Boyle, an international lawyer, of big standing in the United States, says that they can get away with that. They can bring him here and give him many more charges against him. Now, this extradition experience will be a long one. And the last time we had Francis on, he said that he probably could turn, if he loses in Britain, to the European Court of Human Rights and appeal it there, as long as Britain remains part of the European Union. So Brexit might be, the delay of Brexit might be useful to Julian Assange, because he can tie it up there for a long time, and he may get a better judgment as well. It's still not going to be a nice time for him to be in jail now. And I do hope that Marie Maguire, by the way, is allowed to see him, clearly, and she can report back to him about his condition.
Yes, excuse me, I will have to leave you because I had a very short night and a long trip. I was in a conference yesterday and I'm not so young anymore.
It's past 11 p.m. It's past your bedtime, Michelle. I thank you for joining us very, very much.
You. It's
I would
you have a good night.
To think, if you think this is possible, I will send you an email tomorrow with the first draft of the concept. I think the first thing is to make a list of all the topics that have to be in this book. The book should be for a great popular audience, not for academicians or specialists, and in a form that everybody can understand. And if we can make a list of the topics, since you know very well in several countries who is, let's say, a specialist, an expert about this or this question, then you could make a possible list. You have so many good people who have been in these meetings. Then we can discuss about this and see if they agree, and then we can see if we can share the work and try to make the book as soon as possible. I think if we have this, it can be an instrument. You can send it to politicians and say, okay, you cannot say now that you are not informed. Here you have in 200 pages everything you have to know. I don't know if you heard, in Belgium we have a very good new radical communist party called Parti du Travail de Belgique, and they are rising because there is a lot of poverty, there's a lot of discouragement from the traditional parties. And the speaker of this party, Raoul Deboer, I know him personally, asked today that Belgium should give political asylum to Assange. Of course, it's symbolic, but there is a potential, and I think if we can have a book, because, you know, people are not very well informed. Ordinary people are not really informed. And with the book, you can reach a lot of people, honest people, and so they have a weapon.
Absolutely. I think that is a fantastic idea, because it would show the real consensus. We see so much of the creation of a false consensus against Assange. So I think that a book like that really would show the unified front that supports Assange. It would also be something that would make use of the material, the audio material that, I mean, there's hours and hours and hours of vigils, and a very small percentage of those have been transcribed or ever, quoted or documented in articles. So for that reason too, I think a book would be a fantastic idea, to have it in another platform, essentially.
Of course, if you want to go fast, you don't need to make new interviews. You can just take what already exists and make a selection, and then you ask the person, are you okay with that? Do you want to add or make something more precise? And then
Right.
you leave. You can,
I wish that politician would have offered asylum to Assange before Thursday, but that wouldn't have probably mattered anyway. George is with us. Michelle, thank you again very much. Pleasure to have you on. Okay.
Hope to see you again. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
yes.
We're welcoming now George Samzuli, who is a common. How do you pronounce your name, George? I keep.
Samueli.
Okay.
Finally, I had the guts to ask you that in public. Samueli. I'm still going to just call you George because I can figure that one out.
Well, that's
George,
easier.
I visited Hungary once, and that was the first time I'd ever seen a language that didn't have any word in it that I could roughly make out, because it had no relation to Latin, is what I figured out.
No,
right?
no
There were
Latin,
no Latin
no
words.
Yeah. No Latin and no German. Yeah.
And
yeah,
no
exactly.
German. And I was speaking pretty good German in those days, and that's how I communicated with a lot of people, actually. No German, no Latin. Unbelievable. Is it related to somebody? Is it related to Turkish or Finnish?
No, it's
Finnish.
related to Finnish. Yeah,
Finnish. Finnish.
Finno-Ugric. But they're very distant, the languages. So it's not like, if you can speak Hungarian, you'll understand Finnish and vice versa. So
right. But I heard the joke that this tribe left Siberia and went west, and all the smart people made a right turn to Finland and all.
Yeah, but that's what the Finns say. No, that's what the Finns say.
Exactly. It was a Finn who told me, I think. That's right. Actually, I think it was a Serbian guy who told me. But
well, that would make sense. I mean, the Serbs, there's no love lost between the Hungarians and the Serbs. So,
I know. Vojvodina.
Yes.
Yeah, there's that.
That's like Vojvodina. Yeah. Well, that's the problem that, after Trianon, Hungary was really just sliced up. And so a huge part of its population now found itself living in other countries. So all those other countries just absolutely loathe the Hungarians because they're a substantial minority in all of those countries. So you've got Slovakia, you've got Romania, then you've got Serbia, you've got Croatia, and they all have substantial Hungarian minorities. So, there really is no love lost between the Hungarians and.
Well, you know why? You know why? Because they can't understand one word of your language. That's what I was saying. So bring back the Habsburg Empire, please, and we will. That's not
a bad idea. In fact, the irony was that after World War I, and they broke up the Habsburg Empire, and they all became these small states. The Hungarians actually voted to bring back the Habsburg king, the Habsburg pretender. That was about 1919, 1920, something like that. But they were prevented from doing so. Absolute refusal. The Western allies who kind of dominated the scene, they said, nope, you can't have him back. And that was it. So they wanted him back rather than the Austrians. So.
George, I have a question. Back to the kind of topic at hand. I noticed yesterday one of WikiLeaks' tweets after obviously the horrible news about Assange being arrested and expelled from the embassy. WikiLeaks tweeted, quote, note that Ecuador revoked asylum nationality 24 hours after he exposed illegal spying on Assange. His lawyers and doctors, and just days before the UN rapporteurs on torture and privacy were set to meet Assange to investigate rights violations in the embassy. Now, I assume that in the vigil yesterday, which I mostly was able to watch, but didn't watch every minute of it, that this was at least in some way addressed. But I wanted to ask about whether you all had clarified on this Spanish issue, which happened, between the threats of expulsion and the actual expulsion. That was a whole other scandal that erupted in the intervening days that I don't know has been really addressed much. So,
no, I think I haven't seen it addressed. I mean, it was there was that the press conference that you saw with the WikiLeaks and Jennifer Robinson. And that was it. And that was, that was just, basically less than 24 hours before that. And that was my initial response, was that this is somehow retaliation for that press conference. Now, I guess, obviously it's been in the works for a long time, but it is extraordinary. But the extraordinary thing is also that what the British did is really a complete violation of all laws. I mean, if Assange is an Ecuadorian citizen, which he was, then he can only be extradited to the British following an extradition request and a process within the Ecuadorian legal system. I mean, you can't just go in and say, oh, well, we've revoked your citizenship and your asylum. Here he is. I mean, it has to go through some kind of a legal procedure. So that's just simply abduction. Without a legal proceeding, it's nothing more than kidnapping. And so that was an extraordinary thing. And then, of course, it was also extraordinary that the asylum, which cannot be revoked unless it's shown in court that the conditions that triggered the asylum have disappeared. So if it were to establish that the Americans no longer were interested in him, then that would be grounds for ending the asylum. But it was the exact opposite. The Americans were clearly demonstrating that they were even more interested in him than ever. So again, it's doubly illegal. So, I mean, with the idea that these British politicians dare to talk about the rules-based order, that, well, we adhere to the rules-based order as opposed to these terrible Russians. And that somehow Assange is escaping from the rule of law. No, I mean, you are violating the most fundamental international law. There is nothing more fundamental than basically the sacrosanct nature of an embassy. I mean, that's, it goes back centuries, that embassies are inviolable. I mean, you can't get a more basic unit of international law than that.
Yeah, it's horrifying.
Yeah. But I also have a question. Yeah. I also have a question either you or Joe could answer. Glenn Greenwald wrote in his column that the Obama administration did not indict Julian Assange, that this indictment was issued by the Trump administration. And I was just wondering, I mean, is that something that we know for a fact, that there was no indictment issued by the Obama administration?
Well, it wasn't issued. They were preparing one as far back as 2010, apparently. That's when WikiLeaks lawyers first said that they believed that, and they turned out to be true. But it didn't go anywhere, and the understanding I have is that the Obama administration realized that to arrest and in charge a publisher and a journalist would open them up to what they call their New York Times problem, which is they'd have to go after the New York Times then too. Or if they didn't go after New York Times, it would be a clear double standard. So they just let it go. And this more hostile administration to the press didn't look at it that way. We heard what Pompeo said. They wanted to get this man, and they got him right now. And they hopefully he won't get in their hands. It'll stay in Britain, or he will defeat that extradition request. But that's the issue, the way I understand it, that the Obama administration dropped the matter. They did not. But that, I guess, it was.
Well, that's something that wasn't really, the Obama administration was in power till January 2017, and that was certainly wasn't the understanding of Julian Assange or his legal team. I mean, they did believe all this time that a secret indictment had been issued. I mean, that was the
not issued, but had been sealed. If there was one, it was sealed.
Right, okay. So,
issued is a problem. They don't issue it. Excuse me, Elizabeth. They don't issue indictments until an arrest is made. That became clear in that court hearing that I attended, where that committee was trying to get to be unsealed once we learned that it existed. Now, I also could say this, that grand juries can be re-impaneled on the same issues after a certain time. So you can continue to redo that, because I remember when Chelsea Manning first went into prison, she'll be in there for 13 months, I believe. Then they'd have to let her go, but they can impanel it again and give her another subpoena, and the whole thing could happen again. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
Oh, no problem at all. I just wanted to add that I think that one of Glenn Greenwald's major points about what George was just mentioning is the fact that the evidence, or the issue that the Trump administration is prosecuting Assange for, was something they knew about. It's not just that they didn't want to go after him at all. It's the specific, quote unquote evidence was known to the Obama administration. And also, I believe the indictment was issued in March of 2018, if I'm remembering that correctly. So that's so definitely within the Trump administration. But also on Chelsea Manning, I just want to add that, obviously I'm no legal mind, so I have a genuine question that if either of you can answer, I would appreciate it. What is the status with Chelsea Manning? Is she going to be released from prison now that there is a charge? And, what's going to happen with that going forward?
Well, her lawyers issued a statement saying that she should be released now because the indictment has been issued. But the fact is, if there are other charges that the Department of Justice said will be leveled against Assange, that they still need her, apparently. If she doesn't walk out of that courtroom anytime soon, then we know that they consider her to be still an important witness for further charges against him. And it would have to be along the same lines of, did he help her in any way to steal these documents? And I think that Greenwald has destroyed that. And by the way, you were right, Liz, with that point he did make, and I think that's what George was alluding to, that this knowledge, what happened there about the password was known way back into the Obama administration, and they still didn't indict him.
Exactly.
So they also saw that as a threat to the press, because the press clearly has an obligation to protect their sources. And that's all.
But then I wonder, so do you really think that had Julian walked out of the Ecuador embassy anytime between 2012 and 2017, the Americans would not have indicted him? Because that seems to be the implication of what Greenwald is saying, that, so, that's it. Would he have just then walked out and been gone to British court, jump bail, he's out in 6 months? Is that what would have happened?
Incredibly interesting thing you're saying. Yeah.
I know that there were negotiations at a number of different times. There were negotiations of different varieties that were regarding possible immunity that Daniel mentioned earlier, but there are also negotiations prior to the Edward Snowden events that were completely cut off after Assange aided Edward Snowden. So I think that it depends on what time period you're talking about. I don't know. We can't say for sure what would have happened. I assume that he would have been taken into custody immediately. And
I would have thought so.
Yeah, but what you're saying, George, is if they weren't going to indict him, why would they want him in custody then? I mean, of course, Julian Assange and his lawyers could not have known this, that the Obama administration was not going to arrest him and that they didn't have an indictment. The assumption was that there was an indictment. We only learned subsequently, when Obama left office, for sure, that he hadn't indicted Assange. And of course, he'd indicted more whistleblowers, and not that Assange is not a whistleblower, but people who and they're under the Espionage Act than all presidents previously combined. So this was certainly not an administration you could put a lot of faith in that they would let him go. But if in fact what Greenwald is saying is true, that they did not have an intention to indict him, even though they knew about this same password issue, or not password rather, but changing his ID to get into that site. If that's true, then there was never going to be an indictment, but there's no way. And he may have been able to walk out of there, and as you say, serve his time. But they would have probably cooked up. That Swedish thing was still hanging over his head too, by the way. That had not been dropped yet. So he also was worried about that.
But there's also what you just mentioned, the sealed indictment. Now, if it's sealed, it can be unsealed. I mean, all the sealed indictment.
Yesterday. It was unsealed yesterday.
Right, but I mean, it was sealed under the Obama administration. I mean,
I don't know that. Did they actually complete an indictment? They had a grand jury sitting, that's for sure. Now, you're right. The Assange lawyers said that there was a sealed indictment from about 2010.
That's right. That's what they've been saying, that they thought there was a sealed indictment in that Virginia court, the Eastern District of Virginia court. It was a sealed indictment.
I think the only way we're going to get really definitive answers to this really great question is if we have one of Assange's lawyers come on and explain this for us, because I think it is something worth asking and having answered at some point.
Right.
They could be wrong, have been wrong about that fact that there was actually an indictment. Or no, they could also have had an indictment, sealed it, but decided not. Right. Well, they couldn't release it because he wasn't arrested. So this is all, we can't answer these questions right now. That's right. We just don't know. I mean, whether they actually finished an indictment and then were sitting on it and then realized they weren't going to ever use it because they didn't want to cross this line over to arresting a publisher, or not.
Or maybe if he, like, let's say he did walk out of the embassy in 2011 or sorry, he was only in the embassy in 2012. Let's say he leaves the embassy in 2013. I would imagine that whatever, grand jury process was going on, that they would have very quickly produced a charge at that point. So does that make sense?
I think so. I just get the feeling that if the Obama administration really wasn't interested in putting him on trial, I think they would have made it clear to the Tory government in Britain. I said, well, you're wasting a lot of money because we're not really interested in him. I mean, the way they've been playing it all these years, you have to, just go by their, by their gestures or their silences, is that there was a sealed indictment, and that's why they spent all this amount of money on maintaining that security presence outside the embassy, and it wasn't because of bail jumping. So
it definitely seems that way.
So it just seems bizarre that they would be doing it, and the Obama administration would maybe told the Tories, we don't really care that much, the hell with it. That just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I do want to change the subject slightly. I've been alerted that there's some news with Anonymous, and Anonymous has said that that at this time, the Central Bank of Ecuador, the Minister of the Interior, the Ecuador Assembly in the UK, and the government of Ecuador has been offline for 12 plus hours. And if their site comes up, they will fire again to burn their servers. And the hashtag going along with that effort is hashtag Anonymous, hashtag Free Assange, hashtag Op Ecuador, Op Assange, Op UK, and Op US. So I just wanted to kind of alert you all to that.
But they left the Department of Justice out of that.
Apparently.
No, that's a hack. That's a hack.
Right. Of course. Well, I think that most of us who have supported Assange for a long time expected to see something like this should Assange be arrested, and should he, be extradited to the US. I think we would see similar activities taking place for sure.
Right. Well, I'm waiting now for an American politician to say that was Assange who gave a secret order somehow to Anonymous to do this. What relationship Anonymous has with WikiLeaks.
Yeah. Of course, Ecuador. Yeah.
People act on their own in defense of Julian Assange. You don't need to have him tell you to do something.
Right. Yeah, no. And of course, Putin gave the ultimate order. So,
absolutely. Well, that goes without saying, George.
Of course.
He's behind it all. He's behind it all.
That's right. But the interesting thing is, of course, that this has been a big boost for RT, because RT was the only media outlet that actually filmed the arrest. So all the media outlets have now been forced to pay roughly large sums of money to be able to show this footage of the arrest. But it's their own damn fault. I mean, they just didn't bother to set up any kind of camera crew, even though they had to have known, just like RT did, that something big was coming. They didn't bother, so they had to spend money to purchase this footage from RT.
I think it was you, Elizabeth. I think it was you on the emergency meeting we had prior to the arrest that you had asked over the weekend. You asked the question, well, how long will roughly keep those cameras on? And fortunately, they kept them on so we could see. As disturbing as it was for me and a lot of people to see that, it was important to see that.
It was a historical event, and hats off to Raptly and RT for continuing to film, longer than almost anyone on the ground. And obviously they must have had people working in shifts, but, it was really, I was prior to Assange's arrest, and I was really concerned, as I said on the vigil, about what happens when people like Craig Murray, Cassandra Fairbanks, and other people who made the effort to travel to the embassy simply could not afford to stay there any longer. And that's unfortunately exactly what we saw happen, is that the arrest happened a few days after most of those people had to leave. But I think it's a public service what Raptly did, and the fact that they were there to document that historical event. Can you imagine what it would have been like if nobody except maybe an activist on their cell phone had recorded that event? I mean, it would have been a huge loss to history.
Well, a couple of things. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Well,
no, Craig Murray lives in London. Yes.
Okay, yes.
I was going to say Craig Murray lives in London, and maybe he can't afford to live there either, given the rents in London. But
does he live in London? I thought he lived in Scotland.
Oh, Okay, I'm
I
sorry.
think
Lives in the
he's
UK.
mentioned
Oh, okay.
he's mentioned the train ride to London a few
Oh, I
times,
see.
I think, in
All
his
right.
writing.
He lives in Scotland, yeah.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I
Maybe
was
needed a hotel.
just
Oh,
going
you
to
said
add
that
one
was
thing.
yes, please.
And that was just that if Assange had not been, filmed, photographed when he was dragged from the embassy against his will, we could have had conspiracy theories from establishment press saying that he left voluntarily, A, and B, we would not have seen that visual evidence of the toll that the treatment within the embassy has taken on him. Daniel mentioned earlier how sick he looked, and that is the evidence of the torture in slow motion and the assassination in slow motion, as Christine calls it, that we had talked about for months and months and months. And yes, yesterday we saw that before our eyes. So again, hats off to Ruffley for documenting that.
Right.
Well,
No, that was a shocking scene. I mean, you think this is a man in his mid-40s. I mean, it looks like some 80-year-old man being dragged out. This is in his mid-40s. So
it was horrible. It reminded you say it was historic. I come to my mind was the live on TV shooting of Oswald by Jack Ruby,
Right.
and I was 6 years old at the time, and I still don't. My memory, I saw it on TV. I just don't know whether we saw it live or if they had a replay. If they had replays even back then on TV, but I remember seeing that with my mother, and then that's what came to mind when I saw this. It was almost as powerful as that. Moment of capture. But I also think the police, knowing the American police anyway, they love to show the perp walk. They love to show the public we got them, and they did it in broad daylight at 10:30 in the morning. So maybe they were happy that the cameras were there, or they realized there were cameras there, and let's just show them off. But you're right. They did show signs of abuse of this man, and it brings to mind whether the UN, two special rapporteurs of the UN, one for the rights of privacy, one of torture, we're planning to see him on April 25th.
Yep.
I wonder if they could still go to see him in the prison.
Actually, there was a statement that I was reading yesterday by the rapporteur, I believe, on torture. It was one of the two, and they stated, and this was published in basically a news article by the UN itself, and the rapporteur was saying, all this changes is the location in which I meet with Assange, that they will still make efforts to meet with him, they will still be investigating this issue, and so that was really good to hear.
Right, but now they have to get permission from the British government, and I just wonder
how likely is that? Who knows? Yeah,
and they'll have time to maybe clean him up and give him some food and try to reduce signs of torture. But they saw that video. Yeah, you're right. The British government, who ignored the two rulings about arbitrary detention, could very easily ignore what I spent 25 years inside UN headquarters, and I know what especially the Americans and the British, how they think of a UN ruling that they don't agree with.
Exactly.
There's nobody there to enforce that. That's the problem.
Right. And now, will there be any kind of a discussion at the UN Security Council? Have you heard anything along those lines?
No, I have not. I'm not plugged into the UN anymore. I could check it out, but I would highly doubt that, for the simple reason that, first of all, he's under arrest already. But even if there had been a meeting you have to prove that there's a threat to international peace and security, according to the protocols of the United Nations Security Council, the rules. But that has been bent over the years. There have been other issues that have come. Like one of the first ones, I don't want to get too much into arcane UN history here, but the French, or it was actually Richard Holbrooke, the American ambassador at the time, pushed a meeting about AIDS. They wanted a meeting about AIDS, the disease, at Security Council, and there was some pushback because what does this have to do with international peace and security? They were able to argue that it could have an effect of weakening countries, whatnot, or causing. They found a way to put that on the agenda. So it's become easier to put an item on the agenda that doesn't have a direct threat to international peace and security, like troops massed on a border about to invade. That's really what Security Council was set up for. And they can enforce international law by even authorizing military force, as George W. Bush found out when they didn't authorize his military force for Iraq, but he decided to do it anyway, right? So that's another example. Security Council doesn't act, it's illegal. I mean, many Security Council resolutions that are binding that Israel has ignored. So even if they do pass a resolution, it could be ignored by states. But you could have sanctions against that country. I'm not going to see sanctions against Britain for not allowing the rapporteurs to go and visit Julian Assange. For one thing, as a veto, as well as the U.S.
Right.
So
but when Nikki Haley, Nikki Haley was the chair of the Security Council, she ordered meetings on the internal situation in Venezuela, the internal situation in Nicaragua, and I think also something on Lebanon, just to serve Israeli interests. So none of those were in any way international crises, and though the Russians objected precisely on those grounds. Hey, this is nothing international about any of this. She still managed to have a meeting. Now,
that's in the UN Charter that the UN is not to interfere in the internal affairs of countries. That started to break down in the early 90s, and then when we got responsibility to protect, the idea was that we have to the world has to intervene when there's an imminent genocide or crisis, and that also broke down one of those strong tenets of the UN not to do that. And of course, it was abused by the United States and Libya. We're getting off the topic here, but it was abused on Libya when the British parliamentary report came out clearly saying there was no threat of a genocide or any kind of massacre in Benghazi. And yet the U.S. used that, and NATO used that as an excuse to intervene and overthrow the government.
Right.
So,
well, I think it's important context.
The General Assembly, however, I'm really going to go back to some UN context to find out if there's ever been a move to have somebody make a resolution in defense of Assange in the General Assembly. They can say whatever they want because it's not legally binding, but it shows the opinion of the world, and that's very useful. Just in relations with the public, to say, look, the entire majority of the world says that this is wrong and Assange should be released, let's say. That would be we can make a lot of, and his lawyers can make a lot with that in terms of their arguments, even if it's not legally binding.
Right. And you probably get quite a number of countries joining.
I think you would. Even if you just stick it to the United States and Britain. But
what about the UN Human Rights Council? I mean, I know the United States has now left that, but
it's good. So they're not around to screw things up. That would be a good venue for it. But of course, that again would be dismissed by the U.S. because they hate that council. That's why they left it. The Republicans left. Was Bush left, and then Obama went back on, and now Trump has left it again. So that would be a good venue to bring this up. And I don't know why, and I'll look into that, actually.
Yeah, and I know that, and continuing, I guess, to be slightly off topic, but I know that Susie Dawson and I, in our exploration of some of the Snowden files, saw the NSA, basically talking about how it had successfully influenced narratives at the United Nations, specifically referencing the intelligence behind or the creation of Colin Powell's famous weapons of mass destruction speech. So, it's just important to keep in mind that the UN is not entirely free from influence of intelligence agencies from the West, obviously.
Oh my goodness! I call that Powell's vile display.
Right.
And
in the documents, by the way, that we read, that he was bragging. The NSA was bragging about having helped craft that speech specifically, taking credit.
I was there that day. I looked down on the council. It was quite an event. The public gallery was full for the only time I saw in 25 years, and there was a standing ovation from de Villepin, who was the French, I guess, Prime Minister. Foreign minister, right? He gave the
foreign
speech.
Minister under Chirac. Chirac was president. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. There was a standing ovation when he opposed an invasion. Well, the UN could be useful though if the General Assembly would do something, or the Human Rights Council. Yes, I think that's really a good place for it. Other than that, we have the vigils.
Yeah, no. Even if it's not really enforceable in a practical sense, it still helps if the United Nations in any way can shame what the US and UK are doing. I think that serves a really important counterbalance with the propaganda narratives that smear Assange daily. So
no question about it. But the UN has never been a really independent body, except under I think, and Secretary Generals have always been beholden to the U.S., except for Dag Hammarskjöld. It was the only one who stood up to both the Soviet Union and the United States, and he was killed. And there's very good evidence now that the CIA and the MI5 was involved.
Right.
Sorry.
I agree with that. No, I think Boutros Ghali, to a certain extent,
Yes.
also stood up to the Americans, which is why he was kicked out after only one term.
Absolutely. He wrote in his book that he told Madeleine Albright, who was the ambassador then, that the United States was a problem, and she said, "You are our problem." He also wrote that when he was a student, he learned that the Romans never used diplomacy because they didn't need to, and he found out the Americans are the same way.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
right.
he was the only other one beside, and Kofi Annan, when he went off script, when he admitted to a BBC interviewer after being questioned several times on an interview about whether it was an illegal, the invasion of Iraq, he said yes, and then they made his life hell after that, and we got they tried times with oil for food scandal and everything else that happened. So no, the UN is a creation of the United States, and it is still a creature of the United States. So we cannot really look to them for that much help on Assange. But these rapporteurs are independent, by the way. They don't get they are not really part of the UN system, although they have the UN endorsement. They are supposed to have more freedom than and from interference of governments, and that's why they were able to say these things about Assange. And he was in arbitrary detention, and he still is, in a sense. He's being kept on a minor charge. That it's unbelievable that he can get a year for that.
Absolutely. And I also want to just break in and remind people that there are a number of different global events and rallies and shows of solidarity that are being organized, as I say, around the world. And one of them that I want to bring to the audience's attention, if you are in the UK, there will be a Don't Extradite Julian vigil / protest this Sunday the 14th of April at 12 noon in the UK outside Belmarsh Prison. So if you can make it to that, please do. I just wanted to kind of alert the audience to that. And I think any other, if you're in, Australia, the US, any country, in Europe, please look around in your local area and Google whether or not there are any protests in your area. Look on Twitter, be active in trying to make it to an event that you can to show solidarity. So.
Right. Elizabeth or Joe, have you heard anything further about his current condition? What his conditions in his jail are, or anything like that? Whom has he seen, or anything like that? Have you heard anything?
Jennifer Robinson, his lawyer in London, visited him yesterday and gave an interview afterward, and said, given the circumstances, he was in relatively good condition. That's more or less how she put it. So he still has a fighting spirit. There's no question about that. They didn't break him in there. But
when he came out, by giving that thumbs up sign and then the V sign, I mean that was terrific.
Yeah,
that was really spirited. This, he was, and even when he was shouting, I mean, when he was being dragged out, so I mean the still photographs show him like as if he's somehow, he's some crazy person, but he was actually, I mean, he was shouting, sound sensible things, about what the UK was doing. So, it's an amazing spirit, an amazing triumph of the human spirit.
I think the damage was more physical than mental, from what we could see.
Yes,
absolutely. No, I think that I think some part of the reason that people thought it was an awkward way in which he was walking was A, because he was obviously resisting, but B, it was kind of difficult to see in the photographs and the very brief video, but he was also obviously handcuffed, which meant that he couldn't really raise his hands properly. And so that added to that way that he was bent over. But I think it's,
and a violent criminal.
Yeah, and as well, I mean, it was very hard to hear him on that Raptly footage, and obviously he did not have a microphone. Obviously, that's why it was a very low volume and hard to make out what he was saying. But I think, given the fact that he had no microphone, he was obviously shouting very loudly, which was great. I'm glad that he was able to do that.
He was also holding on to Gore Vidal's books.
Right.
He wouldn't let go.
That book was given to him by Stefania Maurizi, the Italian journalist.
Is that right?
She tweeted that today.
Even if the fake news even tried to misconstrue that as having been given to him by Roger Stone. I mean, the detail in which the media goes to lie about Assange is just incredible. It's sickening. So
I doubt Roger Stone knows who Gore Vidal was.
Right.
Or he certainly hasn't read any books. And the book was the history of the American U.S. national security state, or something to that effect. And someone tweeted a link to a speech that Vidal made here at the press club here in Washington on that topic. And I started watching it earlier today, but then I had to prepare for this vigil. But Vidal is a great American writer. He was. I had the chance to interview him once, and that Assange would cherish that book to the point of taking it out with him. Is quite a statement.
Yes, absolutely. But I wonder now, the conditions in British jails, will they allow him to read any books? I mean, are they going, has he been allowed to keep that book, for example?
Good question.
I mean, I know we don't know, but I just wonder, once you're in jail, it's not like they allow you to, just keep books and, read whatever you want, or, read the papers or anything like that.
Well, there are rules about that. I don't think every prisoner can be denied that, but certain ones can under certain conditions, and I'd like to know what they would be. There have been great books like Crime and Punishment. Wasn't that written in a Siberian jail by Dostoevsky?
Right, yes.
So.
Well, the Tsarist regime was a lot more liberal than the contemporary American regime.
That's saying something.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of these people were in prison, and while they were in prison, they were writing away, Lenin, Stalin, they were all in Tsarist jails. They happily, continued their writing.
There was another guy called Adolf in Germany who wrote a book.
Exactly. He also was in prison and, dictating his memoirs.
And I see that we have Peter B. Collins joining us, but as I bring him on, I'd like to add that, obviously whatever the protocol is at the prison in which Assange is being held, I doubt that he would be treated as a normal prisoner. I think that whatever the circumstances are of his imprisonment right now, it is not going to be standard in any sense. And we know, and I know Susie brought this up yesterday, I believe, but I just want to say again that it was in the UK, a UK prison, I believe it was Wandsworth, where Assange allegedly had food, metallic objects placed in his food, hidden in his food. That's what caused the broken tooth, which then has caused him, grievous pain for the last 7 years, 6.5, 7 years. So again, I think we really should be concerned not to become the warriors that Christine Assange warns against, but just to keep that in mind, that the reality Assange faces is not going to be the normal one for an average prisoner.
Right.
So.
Well, let's hope he can read. Before we bring Peter B in, thank you for joining us again. I wanted to recap something I said at the top here, and also have George weigh in, because he wasn't with us then. The editorial in the New York Times yesterday said that that this was an indisputable crime, and but they're very happy that it didn't cross the line into publishing, that it was only about this so-called hack. And Hillary Clinton backed that up last night over in New York, in which she said, that he was not being punished for journalism. Now, Glenn Greenwald blew this out of the water with his piece, in which he cleared it up for me as well. First of all, the word hack only appeared in the Department of Justice press release. It does not appear anywhere in the indictment. And number two, he was not helping. The allegation, that's not even proven. The allegation was not in the indictment that he was helping her to break password to get into the database, the Department of Defense database, because she already had legal access to that. What Assange was allegedly helping her to do was to change her ID, not the password, so that clearly no one would know it was her who had taken these documents. Right. And that's the only thing he may have been helping her. And what Greenwald points out is that's what every journalist has to do. They're obliged to protect their source. So he was working. Yeah. This is an indictment against journalism. I thought yesterday, a lot of us who hadn't seen the indictment, that they had skirted that for the moment, but it looks like they haven't. Peter.
Good afternoon, Joe. Nice to be with you again. Just riffing on the Greenwald piece, I thought it was interesting in a number of ways, in addition to what you just pointed out. One was that late in the article, he offered some criticism of The Intercept for its bungling and fumbling of the reality winner documents and failing to properly redact. And I thought that was an important acknowledgement. The Intercept has studiously avoided, even as it paid for some of the lawyers for Reality Winner, they have avoided really accepting responsibility for essentially screwing their confidential source and consigning her to federal prison. But the most important thing I thought Greenwald noted was the pretextual nature of this. And I'm not quibbling with you, as you just described, you know, the indictment didn't really accuse him of hacking. It was attempted intrusion. And we know that, at least on Assange's part, it was not immediately successful, if it ever was. But the pretext, and this is allowing people in the mainstream media to say, well, like Michelle Goldberg, op-ed in the Times today, she said, well, you know, I don't like Assange, but I am concerned about the precedent that this sets. But they're locking in on the current charge, and I expect that, and I appreciate Kevin Gostola's. Hey, Chloe, come on, I'm talking to the world here. Kevin Gostola has a great piece at Shadowproof today, where he points out that even though Assange is being indicted under a domestic law about computer intrusion, the language parrots the Espionage Act. And so I build on that to speculate that there will be additional charges and that they'll come fairly soon in order to meet the cutoff of the extradition laws and treaties. So my guess is that there will be additional charges. They're probably going to avoid anything related with Russia, unless the Mueller report, as redacted by Bill Barr, includes any actual evidence of that. We're still working off intelligence assessments, and the Times, the Post, and MSNBC continue to use, for example, the indictment that Mueller issued last July of the GRU officers. Rachel Maddow, on her program last night, spent 7 minutes reading from that indictment, treating it as factual. And to be fair, Mueller included a fair amount of specificity in the indictment that makes it plausible for an amateur to read and say, wow, this is really damaging. But they're charges. They're not proven.
They're not convictions. Yeah.
No, are you saying that Rachel is an amateur? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. You know, Joe, I wanted to follow up on our last conversation on Sunday during the vigil. And the proper name for Rachel Maddow's work is not journalism. It is movement media. And that term I was introduced to by a great guy named Michael Eisenmenger. And he provided the independent media facilities for those who covered and protested the WTO convention in Seattle in '99. Anyway, movement media is not journalism. It's people who are reporting, but with a bias and with a sense of passion about what they believe to be the truth. But there's a big distinction between movement media and journalism, and Rachel Maddow and MSNBC are primarily doing movement media, and their movement is the corporate interests aligned with the Democratic Party. So with that said, I think it's important to recognize the pretextual nature of the single charge that has been revealed so far. And I don't know if they will supersede that or if there are other sealed indictments that they can trot out on a moment's notice. But that's my current thinking. And I just want to emphasize that the charge that's been presented is a pretext for the work that WikiLeaks has done in exposing war crimes and excessive secrecy on the part of the U.S. government.
Well, that's a very good point. Right. Go ahead, George. Yeah.
Oh, no, I agree with that. And in fact, it was so cunningly crafted, this indictment, that the U.S. government got from the media exactly the response it wanted. It wanted the media to say, phew, thank God, they're not violating the First Amendment. Great. They're not really going after the journalists. They're not really hitting the press freedom. It's all really about hacking. So that's okay. We know that Julian Assange is a bad guy. He's not a real journalist. He was actually engaged in hacking. Oh, that's okay. So that's exactly the response that they wanted from the journalists, and that's what they got, which was that nothing to worry about here. Don't, everything is fine. Everything is great. We're going after hacking, and we all know hacking is illegal, and that's what they're going after Julian Assange for. And that's it. And that's why I agree. It's pretextual, and it was done precisely in order to get this response from the media, and in the hope that the British courts would then go along and say, well, it is hacking. I mean, that's illegal here, illegal in the US. That's fine. We can extradite him on that. If it were, anything to do with espionage, receiving stolen classified information, then, the media would have been a little nervous, and the British courts would then be questionable. Well, do we really, can we really hand over a journalist who's publishing stolen classified material? That's what journalists do. So it was very cunningly crafted to elicit the response that it did elicit.
Absolutely, as well as the GRU indictment. I think they are very, very attuned to how the media will respond. They write that. I wanted to raise another interesting point that I thought of today when I was interviewed on another program, and that was, in all this reporting about his arrest, there's been hardly anything said about the content of WikiLeaks publications. And it reminds me of what happened when the DNC emails came out and the Podesta emails, that they purposely raised the specter of Russia to change the subject from what those emails actually said about Hillary Clinton. And once again, who's talking about the war crimes, the prima facie evidence of war crimes that was released by WikiLeaks, and so much other stuff, that the content is not being discussed. So if it were discussed, we'd have to juxtapose a man who was the publisher of that stuff going dragged out by policemen and thrown in jail, and the pilots of that of that Black Hawk helicopter, and the officers who gave them the orders, and Rumsfeld and Bush and Cheney and Wolfowitz and the rest who were behind that illegal invasion, walking free. How much greater is that crime than even helping Chelsea Manning to evade detection as being the person who got access to those documents? We got to do a lot more about that. And Don Dubar, who was on the vigil yesterday, came up with an idea where we could work together on a project where we go again, put out in the forefront what WikiLeaks actually has given to the world, and how that contrasts, his treatment contrasts with the ones who are responsible. I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, Joe, I think that's a really important point. Pardon me. And you make fun of me because I watch cable news in an effort to explain it to my podcast listeners. But, I surveyed quite a bit last night, and both CNN and MSNBC treat this as just a criminal suspect, and they do not offer even any acknowledgement of the materials that they used that came from WikiLeaks. And, they never talk about what we actually learned from the release of this information, that none of it has been found to be false or doctored, and that there are very serious issues, whether it was Hillary Clinton's Wall Street speeches, what I believe are financial mispropriety, inappropriate or wrongdoing at the DNC during the 2016 cycle, the collusion between the Clinton Foundation and the top staffers, Huma Abedin and others at the Secretary of State's office. These are very serious matters that are just swept away in the immediacy coverage that they provide. And this is a long-time complaint I've had about American media. They never acknowledge context or history. It's just the now and a little bit about what's ahead, but no sense of even a balanced report. Well, here's some of the good stuff that WikiLeaks did, and here's stuff that you can criticize because it wasn't properly vetted, or, you know, individuals' private information was released. I don't think in supporting Assange, we are taking some pledge to back WikiLeaks 1000%. But the fundamentals are clear, that it performed a vital function. It revealed secrets and crimes that we would not otherwise know about. And the consumers of media deserve to know that, not just be fed a perp. It wasn't even a perp walk. It was a perp carry. And, you know, that loop is going to get played over and over again. But
that's the way that the media play this. Because, I mean, let's take an example of when, I've mentioned this before, I'll just mention it again. Then when the Donald Trump, well, not really sex tape, but the overheard tape with the pussy grab tape that came out 2 days before an important debate with Hillary Clinton. Now, there were two ways of handling that story, which is the content of the conversation, or what has NBC been doing for about 11 years, holding on to this tape. They knew this, they had this in their vault, and then somebody at NBC, we never found out who, decided to release this tape 2 days before the debate. Now, we can go into that. How did this come about? Who was holding on to this tape? Why was it released at this moment? Or we could focus on the content of the tape. The media chose to focus on the content of the tape. But it didn't do the same thing with the Hillary Clinton emails and the DNC emails, which is, how did this come about? You know, who was behind this? You know, was this the Russians and so on? And try to minimize the actual very, very important and damaging information that was on those emails.
Well, you know, when you shoot the messenger, you don't care what's in his packet.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, George. That's a terrific point. That the origin of that tape was never discussed. And they also criticized Assange for the timing of his release and saying that it was designed to hurt Clinton just before the DNC. And of course, it did bring about 5 resignations, another proof that they were accurate. And yet somebody held on to that tape even longer. But I don't know exactly the details, of course, but it seems to me that a news organization works on information when they get it. So we don't know when it was given to Assange exactly, but they have to go through a process of vetting. Now, there are Bernie Sanders supporters who complain that he should have put this stuff out during the primary, because that would have helped Bernie. Why did he wait till after the primary? And then there are the others on the Clinton supporters who say he shouldn't have put it out at all, but certainly he put it out in front of before the DNC because he wanted to hurt Clinton. I think he put it out when he was ready to put it out, when the vetting process was over with. And Stefania Maurizio, who I mentioned earlier, gave the book, Gore Vidal's book to Julian that he was holding as he left yesterday, tweeted that, wrote in an article for Consortium News, an original piece for us, that she worked with, as a partner, the La Repubblica in Italy was a partner media with WikiLeaks. She worked with Assange personally on those Podesta emails, and she says that they were scheduled to come out that day, days in advance, and then the Hollywood Access tape came out, the pussy grabbing tape you're talking about. So that level, the charge against Assange was from Hillary Clinton herself, that clearly they put this out right after the Hollywood Access tape in order to deflect attention from that. And Stefania says that had already been planned.
Right.
Well, and Joe, there was an interesting piece, and it was in I have several caveats here. It was in the Washington Times, the Mooney paper, under the byline of Jerome Corsi earlier this week. And if you don't know Corsi, he is a serial fabulist who did a swift boat attack, a hit piece on Kerry. He wrote a birther book. And that aside, it appears that he has a reasonable claim to having avoided entrapment by Robert Mueller. And at issue, Corsi says that he was the link that Mueller was seeking to connect Roger Stone to WikiLeaks. And through the chain, it would have been Trump, Stone, Corsi, Assange. That was the effort to prove that there was a channel and that there was coordination and collusion. And if Corsi is to be believed, and in this case, I'm inclined to believe him, he resisted some 40 hours of interrogation where they tried to trip him up. And they ultimately offered him a plea deal if he would plead guilty to some sort of crime related to this alleged conduit. So Corsi then becomes an interesting figure here because based on the limited information we have, Barr tells us that Mueller did conclude that Russia hacked, that Russia delivered to WikiLeaks, that Russia meddled in the election. But they were unable to indict anybody for it, despite the significant effort they put in leaning on Corsi. So I think that gives us at least one perspective. It's certainly not complete. On Mueller's efforts to find something that wasn't there. And ultimately, he had to concede that it wasn't there. But it does appear he tried pretty hard, and that Corsi was one of the people he really pounded on.
Yeah, well, as he could have listened to Lisa Page or Peter Strzok, who said there's no there. That was at the very beginning of this. There was no collusion. I never understood how there could have been. If, let's assume Russia did hack the emails and gave them to WikiLeaks, what did they need anybody from the Trump campaign to do for them? That's an intelligence operation they wouldn't want anybody to know about. Why would they want somebody who could open their mouth? So it made no sense whatsoever, the idea that anybody on the Trump team helped in that operation. And I think he did try damn hard to prove this, and he could not. And he could indict GRU agents who he knows will never show up in a U.S. courtroom. But he could not easily indict American citizens who would show up in an American courtroom with lawyers and requests for discovery. So he wasn't going to make things up that he maybe made up about the GRU agents. Yeah. And he didn't indict WikiLeaks, even though they're unindicted co-conspirators in that indictment because they're named as Organization 1. But there was no indictment against WikiLeaks, and there won't be one in this 2016 election. Even though the New York Times in their editorial said that Assange may be able to give up valuable information about the 2016 election. Yeah, he'll show them that it wasn't Russia who did it. That's what he was willing to do before.
Yeah. No, that's another just little detail that is never reported. That, I mean, number one, the vast majority of Americans will get the misimpression that Mueller is responsible for the Assange indictment and extradition filing. And number two, that, you know, that there's stuff hidden in the Mueller report that is going to at least partially vindicate the Russiagate narrative. And I think they're grasping at straws. I'm still awaiting, you know, this claim of the hacking and what evidence might be provided. But consider how Mueller was blown back and surprised by the aggressive response of Concord management on behalf of the St. Petersburg so-called troll farm. They never expected a Russian defendant to have a day in court in the United States, to use the discovery process to try to get Mueller to disclose things he clearly, you know, did not want to reveal.
Because Mueller wasn't really expecting, he didn't realize that if you indict a corporate entity, the corporate entity can be represented in court by attorneys. No one actually needs to show up from the corporation. So in the second indictment, he didn't do that. Everyone was now an individual because he wasn't going to do that corporate entity indictment because he really got his fingers burned on that.
He got freaked out by that. Whatever happened to that case? I guess nothing.
I think it's
Right,
still continuing. Yeah, but yeah, it's.
But that
I
was
think
a part of the collusion. That was part of the interference. Sorry, not the collusion.
right.
That was the Russian
right.
interference by these $100,000 and ads, half of which came after the election, and all of them were half anti-Clinton and half anti-Trump. That was what they claim was a big interference in our election. Just a complete joke. I do make fun of you, Peter, about watching cable news. I just wanted to confirm that, by the way.
I can live with it. Let me just. I have my bin here with the copy from today's podcast, and I wanted to. Yeah, this is the one. The Post has a piece to keep Russiagate alive. Headline: Inside the Russian effort to target Sanders supporters and help elect Trump. Right. Now, this is again talking about information campaigns, and it's prints out to be 7 pages long, and they pound this drum pretty hard that these gullible Sanders voters who didn't know what to do after Hillary got the nomination relied on guidance from Russian messages in social media. So they build the case, the straw man, pretty carefully here. And then toward the end, they talk about a study from Ohio State University that looked at 3 false memes that were advanced during the campaign. And one of them is the false report that the Pope had endorsed Trump. Now, the implication of the Post article is that was part of a Russian information campaign aimed at Sanders voters. Only the Times, and it was Scott Shane, who ran down the false claim that the Pope had endorsed Trump. And he found the guy who created that was an unemployed college graduate who was just trying to make money on the internet. And he had tried a series of posts, exploiting issues about Hillary Clinton, and he didn't make much money with that. So he decided to go with a big bomb, and he said, yeah, Pope Francis has endorsed Trump. Well, that was completely made in America, right? But in today's Washington Post, it is falsely linked to these specious claims of a Russian information campaign that successfully manipulated Sanders voters into flipping to Trump.
But even according to that survey that they cite, they say only 10% of the people surveyed actually believe that that the Pope had endorsed Trump. So in other words, the Sanders voters didn't believe it. They weren't buying it. It was 10%. I mean, that's just of the people that they had surveyed, 10% said, yeah, they believe that story. So that's nothing.
Right.
The recycling, that time story was well over a year or 2 ago, wasn't it? That was a long time. I remember that they'd unmasked this guy who had created that just to make money, right?
I think the article was in the fall of 2016. I think it was after the election.
Yeah, more than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And here the Washington Post is recycling that today in their desperation to keep Russiagate alive. It's like a variation of Jesse Jackson's Keep Hope Alive, right?
Yeah.
Keep Russiagate alive.
I think I've described Russiagate as this undead monster that can't be killed because it should be dead, but for some reason it's still ambling along kind of infinitively, just forever.
We got to find the silver bullet that kills the monster.
Well, it's definitely because it's not really meant to be proven factually. I doubt that we will ever that the said silver bullet would be factual evidence. I think it would have to be something other than that, or in addition to that, because there's been lots of evidence countering it so far. But
Mueller's statement there was no collusion has not killed it off.
Absolutely.
Well, and I find it interesting this week because Bill Barr outraged Jimmy the Perjurer and others who now have paid purchase on cable news channels. And James Clapper was outraged that Barr would suggest that there should be an investigation of the Mueller investigation. Now, I do think that Barr was pretty inarticulate as he floated that. And it's fair to say that each hearing he goes to, he tells a different story about when he's going to release the report and what's going to be redacted and who gets what and all that. But to his central skepticism and the idea that the FISA court might have been lied to again in the issuance of the first and successive warrants to surveil Carter Page. I'd like to know. I don't trust Barr to conduct an even-handed investigation, but I fundamentally believe that the FISA court has no place in American government, and that we shouldn't be talking about how to put an ombudsman in there or some way to soften the fact that this is a secret star chamber, and that it has been. I mean, Reggie Walton is a big booster of the deep state. And when he presided as the chief judge of the FISA court, he repeatedly excoriated the agencies who appeared before him for giving him lies and incomplete information and data that he couldn't verify. So even inside the star chamber, they know that it's a sham. And so on the one hand, I welcome anything that leads to people asking questions about these arms of the state and how they are used and abused. But I don't have any confidence that Barr would run a fair investigation.
Well, he did say, I think what you're referring to is that he believed there was spying on the Trump campaign by the FBI. And that's what caused this storm when he said that. And we have David Nunes, who is now the minority leader of the House Intelligence Committee, who's going to come out maybe this week with 8 names of people he said were involved and should be investigated. Now, not to make this a love fest of Glenn Greenwald, but he had an interesting tweet today in which he countered this this horror of people like Clapper, that how could you investigate the FBI, by reminding us of the Church Committee, which of course was in the mid-1970s, was a huge look by the Senate, there was no Intelligence Committee, by the Senate into crimes committed by the FBI and the CIA over the years since their establishment. It was a huge, huge uncovering. And out of that report, we had 2 reforms. We created the Intelligence Committees in the House and Senate, and this very court that you're calling a star chamber, Peter, the FISA Intelligence Court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act Court. And I think the problem is that it's a rubber stamp court, not that it exists. The idea is that they can't spy on Americans without without a warrant, rather. I think that's a good idea. The court doesn't function well, not only because of what you just said, that Walton pointed out that they were lied to, but they are manipulated all the time by the intelligence agencies. But they also become just a rubber stamp. They don't understand the issues. They don't understand, apparently, intelligence matters very well. And they just go along for the most part. Most of the judges, he was one who spoke out against it. So I think the FISA court is good. And it would be useful maybe to investigate to see if there was indeed spying on the Trump campaign. Not because I know that will help Trump, and that's not good, but because intelligence agencies, in my view, are more powerful than elected governments, and they have to be reined in, and they have to be controlled, and they have to be policed.
Right. Well, exactly. And that's why you get the situations as you did in the latter not even the latter, certain stages of the Soviet Union, when the KGB was a kind of all-powerful institution in which were terrified because they just, the KGB had secrets on them. I mean, therefore, they could be blackmailed, they could be coerced, anything that they can do. And I think we're sort of getting there now. That they just have this information, and they don't like you. Off they go to the FISA court and say, well, we've got good evidence that he may be working for the Russians or he's working for the Chinese or whatever. Give us a warrant to survey him. So it's kind of an alarming situation. It's nothing to do with Trump. It's an alarming situation.
Well, and I heard Clapper on CNN responding to Barr's questions and his assertion about spying, you know, with this kind of phony outrage. And he flatly declared that the FISA court is no rubber stamp. And he, you know, I'm sorry, the numbers don't bear that out in even a remote way. And the times when the court has declined a warrant request, they typically said, we'll fix these 3 things and bring it back to us next week. We'll have the rubber stamp ready. So, you know, I just believe that at minimum, the work of the FISA court should be fully disclosed periodically, so that, you know, every year they've got to honestly report what they did and what the basis for it was. And I don't see that ever happening.
No. I'd like to move this back, if I can, to the issue at hand by asking a question of both of our guests and of Elizabeth. I had this feeling yesterday that there's something positive that can come out of the arrest of Assange yesterday. And that was perhaps Kim.com who put that on my mind, because he's somewhat optimistic that Assange has a chance to beat the extradition rap. But I went beyond that. I began to see a lot of people, journalists and others, who have started to say, well, there is a problem here maybe with this arresting a publisher. While he was stuck away in that embassy, they'd had him shut up, had him cut off, and forgotten for the most part, except for us here, supporters and Vigil and elsewhere. He pretty much was not in the news anymore. And suddenly, this has become a huge issue. They have forced the issue by arresting him. And there could be a backlash. And I'm beginning to see people coming out of the woodwork saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we didn't want to go that far to arrest this guy. What do you think, George and Peter? Do you sense that there could be something good that can come out of this?
I have to say, I'm not as sanguine as Kim.com. I tend to think that, yes, the mainstream media will probably not be terribly happy if the US government does indeed bring these espionage charges against him. But ultimately, I don't think they're going to do much about it. I mean, what's the New York Times going to do? They go on strike? You know, is the editor of the Times, and are they going to go lobby the DOJ, stand outside the DOJ building, shaking their fists, demanding justice for Assange? I just don't see it. In all this time, they have expressed not one word of sympathy for Julian Assange or for Bradley and then eventually Chelsea Manning. Not one word. They had no sympathy whatever. So they knew all along what was at stake here. They knew perfectly well that they had cooperated with WikiLeaks, that they were doing the same thing as WikiLeaks was doing. They were publishing information. They were collaborating with WikiLeaks in disclosing classified information. They knew all this, and yet they didn't lift one finger and express any support for it. So I just don't see that they're suddenly going to wake up and say, my God, press freedom is in danger. You know, we've got to, you know, go out into the streets and shake our fists at the DOJ. I don't see it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I think they'll just swallow it and maybe whine a little, but they'll go along with it.
What do you
Well,
think here?
They have to be careful, by the way, because the FBI is right across the street from the DOJ, but shouldn't get too riled up there. Peter.
Well, I'm afraid I agree with George. Americans are so passive, and they're easily led. And when you have no Pied Piper in the mainstream media for First Amendment rights, the rights of publishers, the right to know, the right to be free of excessive secrecy, too many Americans are just caught up in the whole hysteria of these narratives that everything we do is good and right, and we're just surrounded by evildoers who we need to smite. And you know, I don't have much confidence in what remains of the progressive left. It's been splintered by Russiagate, by the pivot of Democrats and so-called liberal media figures into the anti-Russia hysteria. And, you know, most of this does revolve around attitudes toward Trump, where people are pushed and wedged in to accept things that were unacceptable to them just a few years ago. You know, a muscular approach toward Iran, threatening war, and just look at Venezuela. You know, how few Americans really have an informed view of the regime change effort that's underway, the false claims that Maduro didn't have a legitimate election. And so I'm not optimistic that Americans will stand firm. They're pretty, you know, willing to write off Assange. One of my listeners sent me a link to it's called countable.us. I think it's run by Axios. But they're just random, you know, comments from people. I hope they hang that bastard by his thumbs. Not an American citizen and expose all those secrets. Maybe he will have an unfortunate accident, Putin style. Right. You know, you can pretty well suss out where that person got his or her information. There are people here, true journalism's being silenced. Free Julian Assange. Then here's a guy who says Assange in the Manning case actually helped to breach and release sensitive military documents. His actions condoned and empowered Russians acting to upset the US 2016 election. These are not the actions of a journalist. So, you know, I want to underscore that these are random and anecdotal, but
they're more than anecdotal because these are staff people. These, I mean, I'm not saying that these tweets, but I saw a lot of tweets over the last few days, last 2 days rather, from Axios people, from people who work for the Daily Beast, for the New Yorker, Salon, and they're very much along those lines. That he's not a real journalist. You know, he deserves everything he's going to get. You know, hope they fry him. As I say, these aren't just simply random people on the internet. These are people who are on staff to these so-called liberal, leftish, progressive publications. This is the kind of thing that they're tweeting out.
Yeah, well, it definitely seems like the quote "he's not a journalist" narrative has replaced a lot of the previous narratives that were almost copy-pasted by so many trolls, as well as figures, as you mentioned, George. It's like, I know that, you know, for years it was, he can leave whenever he wants. It was, right, you know, Assange is a sexual abuser, et cetera, et cetera. And now that that's fallen away, that he is not a journalist is the chorus that's being sung from all establishment backing kind of corners.
Right, exactly.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for destroying my optimism there. Okay.
And Joe, let me just share. I get these promotional emails from the New Yorker, and these are the equivalent of social media posts. You know, you get an impression off of the headline and a subhead, but you never actually click through and read the whole story. So here's they have Rafi Kachadurian, who wrote up their Assange piece. The headline, Julian Assange versus the Trump administration. Subhead, the WikiLeaks founder has welcomed the degradation of US norms and institutions. Now his fate will be determined by the health of those same institutions.
Oh God. Nausea coming over me, yeah.
Yeah, well, and also there was a headline by The Telegraph, I think, yesterday that said something about Assange being a left-wing dupe, apparently, but just absolutely horrendous headlines from outlets like The Telegraph and others as the ones that Peter just mentioned. It's despicable, honestly. And I'm going to try and find the exact headline so I can share it in a second, but...
Yeah, I looked at the Daily Mail yesterday, and you know, it was these, and these are tabloids, I understand, but they were appealing to the fuzz and was reader who, and this is one of my pet theories too about reality television, is that the corporate producers use sophisticated market research to find out what makes your skin crawl. And then they put that on TV. And we are, more and more couch potatoes with the power of the remote operating as voyeurs in a world that we're fairly detached from and don't have too much interest in venturing outside our little cocoon to challenge authority, support rights, or do anything more than, think about taking pictures of our next meal to put on social media.
Yeah, and I brought up the headline from the Telegraph I was just mentioning, and it says specifically, quote, Julian Assange, useful idiot and left-wing dupe, will finally have to answer for his actions. That's the headline. I mean, it's very, very disappointing to see this type of reporting on this. But
right. And even the people who are sympathetic to him and who are, quite decent, they always have to preface their articles and comments with, well, whatever you may think of Julian Assange, and though I'm no fan of Julian Assange, and though Julian Assange himself sucks, blah, blah, blah. And they all just put these things out there, never really explaining, well, why does he suck? Well, what's wrong with him? Why do we sort of have to think something ill of him before we actually say something positive about him? What has he done that is, morally based? I mean, no one's ever spelled out, does he abuse his wife? I mean, does he abuse children? Has he stolen anything? Has he plagiarized anything? No one's ever spelled out what it is that we're always supposed to say, well, whatever else you may think about him, and, however ghastly a person he may be, what's the gravamen of these charges against him? What, that he's had sex with women that he wasn't married to? I mean, is that what it's come to? That we're supposed to be outraged by that?
Well, in addition to that, I also saw a number of people, I believe Ro Khanna from also said, in a similar type of preface, but almost very much worse than that. He said, well, I don't even believe that Assange is a journalist, but these charges are a danger to the free press. So I think that there are lots of different manifestations of that type of narrative, which again are feeding into the overall propaganda smears of the establishment, even as they are trying to, maybe protect free press.
Exactly, because it then seeps into the subconscious that he really has done terrible things and he's a terrible person, even if maybe we need to defend him on this and that, but he really is somebody who's a really bad person that we've got to stay away from. And, and it just simply, people just go on repeating that, even if they can't actually spell out what it is that he's done that's bad. They just simply repeat it. He's someone we got to, stay away from.
Well, George, it is challenging to operate in an environment where so many people believe the worst about Assange. Mm-hmm. And I will plead guilty that I've occasionally not used quite what you said, but I'll say, he may not be the warm and fuzzy guy that you want to sit down next to on the couch. But, we need to focus beyond him as an individual and look at what is truly at stake here. And it is difficult because the predominant view is that he's a monster. And if you spend all your time saying, well, he's not really a monster, you can't get to the main point. So sometimes in the effort to argue the principles, I think people do make those kinds of comments about Assange just to get past the barricade that people throw up in their own minds. And let me take a minute here. We here in San Francisco, we have a really weak radio station that carries what are called progressive talk shows. And I used to be part of the progressive talk radio syndication effort in this country. And Air America just did everything wrong and poisoned the well for liberal talk radio in this country. So it's minimal. There are only a handful of shows. So yesterday I was driving home and I put this station on, and there's a guy, he's a lawyer, his name is Rick Unger, and I tuned in just as he was going to a break, and he said, yeah, we're going to talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. I don't think there's much to the story right now, but it's going to get interesting. And then he made false statements. He hadn't done any homework. He said Assange is facing an array of heavy charges. And he said that twice. So I picked up my phone and I called in on the listener line, and it turns out that his show isn't live when I hear it. So it went to a voicemail box, and the host himself, Rick, texted me back 5 minutes later. And the message I left was that, hey, you know, you can have opinions, that's fine, but you really ought to do your homework and get your facts straight. So he responded by text. I did make a mistake. Assange is facing an additional charge in England for busting his bail. But I did say he was facing a myriad of charges here, and that was incorrect. I'll correct it on tomorrow's show. Sorry it made you so angry. So I replied, well, thanks for replying, Rick. In addition to the facts, I ask you to rethink your comment that the Assange arrest is not an important story yet. I think there's an important principle here regarding the abuse of secrecy to cover up war crimes. I heard you equivocating and doing the Captain Obvious, good guy or bad guy question. The real issue here is about the First Amendment and the right to publish. The indictment does not relate to the Mueller investigation, but most people will think it's about the allegation of Russian hacking released by WikiLeaks. I'd like to hear you take a strong stand for freedom of the press and an end to excessive secrecy. So he replied, you can make the case for excessive secrecy. However, I do not agree it is a freedom of the press issue. If someone steals secrets and gives them to a journalist, the journalist has every right to publish. However, when you participate in the theft, that is not freedom of the press. So he has swallowed the pretext.
Right.
And he's making a strong argument countering my points, saying that this is simply about stolen materials. And this is the exit that has been provided by this narrow indictment that is not about publishing. It allows people like him to smugly conclude, I don't have to pay attention to this because he's a thief. And that's the end of this story.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's really sad that I think it's also that goes to the point that in addition to the fact that smearing Assange, is really easy. It goes along with propaganda narratives. It's also easy in the sense, as you say, they don't have to do homework. They can just copy paste what another outlet said in smearing Assange. It's the easy way out. And unfortunately, because everything is so complicated around Assange and WikiLeaks, it's very difficult to report accurately sometimes on certain issues, even if you want to. And I want to welcome both Margaret Kimberly and the amazing...
I can figure out which way is the most light.
Right, yeah, and also the amazing Daniel Ellsberg, who is with us now. So welcome to both of you, and thank you. We appreciate you making the time to join us. Daniel, can you hear us? Okay, we can't hear you, so you'll have to either click the join audio button in the bottom left, or Joe B, our technical support, will try and talk with you as we continue. So, Margaret, what thoughts do you have about recent events and unfortunately, especially the events of yesterday?
Yeah, it's devastating. It was a shock and not a shock. I shouldn't have been surprised. It's obvious they've been working on this for a couple of weeks and finally made their move. So it was frankly depressing at first. But I don't want to give in to that. I think now the most important thing is to do what we've been doing, to keep fighting for Julian, to fight the narrative, to fight the lies that people are telling about him. People don't even know why he's under, indictment. I keep hearing people talking about the DNC emails, and I keep reminding people, and it's something we all have to do. This is about he revealed war crimes. He and Chelsea Manning revealed American war crimes. And I just ask people, do you think he should be in jail for revealing a truth, revealing that war is a war? The Iraq war, the media were embedded So they did not. That's why they embedded them. They wanted to make sure they didn't show people what happens in an occupation, a brutal occupation. That's why he's in jail. And when you say those words, it forces people to think. And they stop talking about Hillary Clinton and, all sorts of things that aren't really, while people may have opinions, aren't relevant. But their opinions are also based on lies. We know there was a leak and not a hack. But we're all living with the lies told by corporate media that have kept people confused. But it's our job to keep being the truth tellers about Julian and about Chelsea Manning too.
Daniel, can you hear me? Dan
yes,
in Berkeley.
Can you hear me?
Oh,
Perfect.
yes. Thank you for joining us, Dan. Well, I just want to ask your thoughts about what you saw yesterday and what's been developing.
If you're asking me, what we saw is an escalation of Trump's war on the press, which he calls the enemy of the people. And this is actually a new one. It's the most important indictment and trial or possible trial that we've been looking at in a number of years. The trials of Chelsea Manning, Jeffrey Sterling, and the attempt to force James Risen to testify under pain of contempt. The Jeffrey Sterling case all raised very important questions of freedom of the press and the First Amendment. But in constitutional terms, First Amendment, in a way, this is an escalation that has no precedent before. It's a rise from my case almost 50 years ago, which was the first prosecution of a source, of a former official who had revealed unauthorized disclosures to the American public. That was the first use of the Espionage Act, which, by the way, has not yet been charged against Julian, but let me predict right now, not certainly, but with very high odds, we will see further charges against Julian and very likely the Espionage Act charges as well. But even without those, we're seeing now the first prosecution of a journalist, an editor, a publisher. I think he's best regarded as a publisher at this point, someone whose role in the process of getting information to the public, starting with a whistleblower, let's say, is absolutely essential. Chelsea Manning, or for that matter, I could not have made let me correct that in a moment, I could not have made my information, 7,000 pages, available to the public without the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 other newspapers at that time. There was not a digital world at that time. Chelsea Manning actually could have very easily put all of her information on the net. Not only technically did she have every ability to do that, but it was simply there, even for people who weren't as technically qualified as she. But she chose not to do that. She went first to the Post and the Times, as I did. They ignored her. In this case, she went to WikiLeaks, an outlet which she assumed would make the information available to newspapers who could turn their whole staffs on the issue of putting it out, selecting what was most newsworthy and what was most urgent, and possibly redacting. A failure to redact by some of the newspapers, and to some extent by Julian later, was not Chelsea's decision, nor was it Ed Snowden's, who did much the same. I think there's a couple points here that I didn't expect the mainstream press to deal with, but one of them I find has been dealt with pretty well, leading up till now, by the Wall Street Journal, which is really very good in its reporting, despite their horrible editorial page and their editorials. And they have brought out something that I only speculated about earlier, and that was the price on Julian's head in the eyes of the Ecuadorian government. I speculated that the year intervening between the indictment, the sealed indictment against Julian on March 2018, which was apparently done just days before the statute of limitations would have run out. So they wanted to have that one in hand as of a year ago. Why did it take them a year now to bring this out now? Well, a couple things. The British may have been involved in that decision. There may be other types. But the Ecuadorian government is, President Lenin Moreno is right now involved in negotiating debt relief from the IMF and from the World Bank, and where the US has the primary voice on these decisions as the main stakeholder in the IMF and the World Bank, have often used that against other countries that it wanted to influence, acting indirectly through the IMF and the World Bank. And the Wall Street Journal makes clear, and I'm going to tweet out the references to this, over the last year, actually, that the US has used IMF threats, that is, threats of influencing the IMF, against Ecuador in other cases this very year. One of them, by the way, to get them to cancel some report that favored, a UN report, I think, favored breastfeeding over formula. And this is really wild in a way to show the kind of thing that Chelsea Manning revealed, which was the influence of the US over the third world and of other countries over the third world. She said at the time, it wasn't just to reveal straight wrongdoing or against our national security or anything else. She showed that, for instance, in cables, that the US was influencing Haiti against employment conditions, union organizing and whatnot, in Haiti, for example, to the benefit of US corporations. Now, the Wall Street Journal, I know we don't have a lot of time here, but let me just mention fast. The Wall Street Journal reveals that reportedly, and I think WikiLeaks put this out earlier, which didn't endear them, I'm sure, to Ecuador or the US, that the US was giving conditions to Ecuador as to whether they would support this debt relief that Moreno was bargaining for. And the two reported conditions were hand over Julian Assange, and two, drop criminal charges against Chevron for polluting the environment of Ecuador. And in fact, the journal mentioned that there's they have not cleaned up that mess that Chevron put over a matter of years because it was needed in evidence against the criminal suits against that front. They have just started cleaning up that mess for the first time now for the government, evidently in preparation to drop charges against Chevron. So Assange is not the only thing on Trump's mind here or the US government's mind. It's just one of those things that an empire busies itself with, as Chelsea Manning revealed through Assange with the State Department cables back in 2010. Okay, by the way, what was the price, it turns out? Over $4 billion from the IMF and $6 billion from the World Bank and other organizations. Now, at least Moreno didn't sell out cheaply, I think you could have to say. That's an honorable price for Julian to have on his head, $10 billion. How much would that isn't even US money directly out of the taxpayers directly. How much would Trump have given to get him? Well, more than that, I would say. So that's what we have. And why did this happen right now? The negotiations are going on right now. One other point that has not been brought out adequately by the press reporting of this so far is this. The impression has been given that Julian, as I call him, that's what I like, even though I don't agree. We have an argument about this, Joe, and we don't have to have it on now with all of his judgments ever or in the last couple of years. But I am not one of those people who dislikes Julian, which has made it easier for Trump to use him as the test case here against the press. But the fact is that he's widely unpopular, starting with a very unfavorable and unfair profile of him that came out back in 2010 by the New York Times, no less. I got much the same treatment from the Times, believe it or not, at that time, as I told Julian. But the question is, the indictment has been shaped so as to give the impression, which the press has largely fallen into, that Julian made it possible for Chelsea to have access to the files and the hundreds of thousands of files that she gave. In other words, that Julian was in effect stealing those files in a way that would not have occurred otherwise, which is described as unjournalistic practice. Another part of the indictment refers to the fact that Assange asked for more documents, encouraged her to give more documents. After she said she'd given him all she had at that point, she'd already given hundreds of thousands of files. And he said, curious eyes, don't go dry, after which he gave her more. He did not move to make files available to her that she didn't already have. My understanding of it as of now, from what I've read, is that Chelsea had access to the files, and what she wanted help on was to get an anonymous username through a password that would conceal her identity as the person who was getting the files. Journalists do that all the time, of helping to conceal the identity and make it confidential. And of course, that's necessary to investigative reporting that is especially in the field that's, really any reporting that embarrasses the government, any whistleblowing, not only whistleblowing that involves classified information. She's charged with using enciphered, encrypted chat channels. Well, the New York Times does that, as do many other papers, with the help of an organization of which I'm on the board, the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which helped the Times and many other papers get secure drop, an encrypted method for whistleblowers and leakers in general to get information confidentially and to keep from the kinds of prosecutions that 9 people encountered under Obama. So again, I am in this picture here in the experience, in the sense of being on that board, on the one hand, potentially being charged with encouraging this kind of thing, which I do. Encouraging people to do whistleblowing, I do that all the time for the last 40 years and more. Being encouraged to give documents, Neil Sheehan did that to me, and very much so in 1971. But earlier than that, I had given documents to Neil Sheehan, in part under the explicit encouragement of Tom Wicks, his boss as Washington bureau chief, who asked me for documents. I just might mention, I had the documents in question in my pocket at the time and was there to give them to Neil Sheehan, but Tom Wicks, later an editor of the Times and columnist, asked me for them directly in front of not only Neil, which was fine, but Hedrick Smith, who I didn't know at the time. And I was shocked that he would, in front of somebody that I didn't even know, talk about handing over classified documents, which these were. In fact, it involved the year-end official report of General Westmoreland to Lyndon Johnson, in which he said at the end of January 1968, we have pursued the enemy to the borders, expelled the Viet Cong from, this is a paraphrase, from South Vietnam. We are pursuing him there. In other words, end of the war is in sight. And days later, the Viet Cong from inside South Vietnam attacked every province capital and nearly every district capital simultaneously in Vietnam. And when that was published in the New York Times, by the way, some of my leaks that were given the false byline of Saigon, leaks that I had given exclusively to Neil Sheehan in DC, were given the not byline, but place,
Dateline, yeah.
Dateline from Saigon to indicate, to throw people off as to who their source was. Exactly what Assange is charged with here now in connection with.
So they've crossed the line, Dan.
So in short, what he's doing here is definitely, this isn't a risk, as Michelle Goldberg has just said in a column I just read, a risk that he will turn this efforts against journalists. It's happening right now. And of course, it's part of his war. It's on now. And if I can use myself as one more example, you don't have to agree with everything that, every judgment that Julian has made in the last couple of years, as I see it, judgments he's made after being in one room, essentially, for almost 7 years. I don't judge somebody personally that heavily. I don't know, I doubt if I would, not, in this state, agree with every judgment I might make after 7 years in solitary confinement, essentially. Well,
I'd like to add something about that.
Support unreservedly his effort to avoid extradition and to support him in the defense in his trial. All journalism, and that means free speech in this country, and democracy in this country is at stake. And frankly, the rights of everyone in asylum has just been jeopardized and diminished at this point in any country, whether it's this country or Britain or Russia or anywhere else. I would think Ed Snowden, this won't surprise him too much, but every asylum seeker has to realize that their status, despite international norms here, has a price on it. And Trump met Ecuador's price.
I just wanted to point out that a couple of things. Part of the reason they're doing this is to put the fear into anyone who considers whistleblowing. Who's going to whistleblow after this? Also, I'm thoroughly disgusted with liberals who've been calling themselves the resistance, who've been calling Trump a fascist. And this is straight up 100% card-carrying fascism, and you hear crickets. Or you hear criticism of Julian because he did this or because he did that, or he was accused of this or that other thing. And now is their chance to speak up for the press. Trump gets into some stupid pissing match with Jim Acosta or whoever the hell about nothing. And here we have the rights of journalism being subverted completely by a man the liberal resistance claim to hate, and they don't say anything. Or what they do say is critical of Julian, the person who is the victim. And also these nations that are supposed to be democracies, the United States, the UK, Australia, which is threw their citizen under a bus, we have to call them out too, because they're not democracies. If you're not going to protect people in a situation, this is the proof of a democracy. And they have failed it. The people who've been calling themselves the resistance have shown themselves to be who they are. And I think we have to unreservedly, as Daniel Ellsberg just said, defend Julian, no ifs, no ands, no buts, because he is in very serious trouble. We're all in serious trouble, all of us. And this is the moment for people to say so.
So, Dan, we were talking earlier about what you brought up at the end here, that he has crossed the line into targeting what journalists do, which is to protect their sources. That press release from the Department of Justice was purposely misleading in saying he was accused of a hack. But the indictment doesn't have the word hack in it, and he did not try to get her to break into this computer, as the New York Times editorial says yesterday, because she already had legal access to it, as you've pointed out. And what Assange was doing was what any journalist would do, is just protect their source to help her to change her identity there. So we've already crossed into that, although the corporate media seems to be breathing a sigh of relief that didn't happen, and in fact did. And you believe, as you said, that the next indictments will go even further then in terms of the Espionage Act to criminalize possession and dissemination of classified information, which the Act clearly says can be done. You think that they're going to do that? They're going to need more to put him away. They want him away for more than 5 years, don't they?
They're not going to be content, I don't think, Trump or the intelligence community, which is so embarrassed by the revelation, for example, by Ed Snowden of their widespread criminality. They wouldn't be content with 5 years for Ed Snowden or Julian Assange. And of course, Chelsea already spent 7 years and is in prison right now, jail right now, for refusing to cooperate with a grand jury in secret and in testimony. I suspect they want to use her as a witness against Julian when there's a trial, which is not certain. If Britain is led to obey the feeling in the UN Human Rights Commission and so forth, that he should not have been held and should not be extradited. But yeah, so I think they will definitely wage further charges, whether or not they use the Espionage Act. And that business of hacking, I suspect, which was in their headline, in their press release, is clearly not a question of hacking here. As I say, it's the wrong impression that Julian helped her get access. She had access to those files. It was a question of concealing her identity, which she was anxious to do, except that she told me that she always expected that if she were accused, if she were arrested, if she were identified, she would reveal herself, as I did and as Ed Snowden did, for the same reason, to keep other people from being wrongly indicted or wrongly accused. So in that respect, she intended to act the same way.
The fact that she's still in jail means they still need her to talk in order to probably bring about these other charges. So she could perhaps delay this. They certainly need her. They need her testimony pretty badly to throw her in jail, right? So is she delaying possibly any further charges?
They have these
what do they need from her?
They will try to compel her to testimony, and I can't. I don't know what decision she'll make there in the end, but I do know this, that she's not a person to be tortured into giving false testimony, which they would be happy to have. They would love to have testimony from her and would probably, offer her this or that, and certainly get her out of jail if she was willing to testify falsely against her earlier testimony that Julian Assange had, in fact, strongly induced her. For example, one thing that, as far as I can tell, they don't know yet, because it didn't come up in her other testimony, is whether this effort to get crack a password that would allow her to use the identity of an administrator of a system, which she wasn't, an anonymous identity, which, by the way, Ed Snowden had. He was an administrator, could get into anything. Now, they don't know, as far as I can tell, whether that succeeded at all. In fact, the implication is, I think, that it didn't. But they would love to hear from her under oath whether, in fact, that did help her get in some way. That would be an additional thing against Assange. She certainly isn't going to do that falsely. She was in solitary confinement for 10.5 months, regarded by the UN rapporteur for torture as a form of torture. And torture is for getting false confessions, not from Chelsea Manning. They're not going to get. They didn't
Is
get
it a crime?
Now.
Is it a crime to identify yourself falsely and when you're trying to sign into a Defense Department computer, or is it just military rules?
Oh, it's not just military. It would have been under oath. She was making these statements. They could charge her with perjury before, but if she changed her testimony. But I think they are prepared to offer her immunity for perjury.
Yeah, they did. They offered her immunity. Yes. No, but my question was, if she had successfully changed her identity to get into the computer with Assange's help, let's say, is that itself a crime, just to have a false identity when you're signing in, or is it just a military rule there?
No, not for him, definitely. For her, if she was in the military, yeah, it would probably be one more charge against her. But in fact, I think she acknowledged in court, she pled guilty, to some of the charges, including the fact that she had basically given information. So they didn't need that extra count against her. But I think they would like to charge, they've given the impression successfully and falsely that the files became accessible to her by help of Julian Assange, or at least that he attempted that. And that would be potentially a charge. It's a gray area as far as I know. Certainly no one has been extradited for it, but I'm not sure that anyone has been charged with that. Tom Drake finally, as a plea bargain, a very minimal kind of plea bargain, finally pled guilty to it might even be a misdemeanor rather than a felony.
Unauthorized use of a government
unauthorized
computer.
access to a computer.
Use,
and,
yeah.
So this whole area of computer things is frankly after my time. They didn't charge me with that because they didn't have personal computers. But and
that would have made your life a lot easier, though, in terms of copying the documents.
Oh, it would have been a lot easier, but I couldn't have done what I did without Xerox. That's an unsolicited ad for Xerox earlier. But but I couldn't have done the hundreds of thousands of files that Chelsea gave rightly, in my opinion, and Ed Snowden likewise, I would say, without, except in the digital era. But that has raised a whole new area of law, which frankly does change the situation for leakers. It's made it, of course, a lot easier for them to put out masses of information, but not so much to keep from identity. In other words, they can trace the trail of those things. In my time, I was charged with conversion or theft, but the major lawyer, expert legal scholar on law of information, Melville Nimmer, said then that what I had done was copy And in those days, copying information definitely was not theft, that I was wrongly charged and should have been, that charge should have been dismissed. That's not true now, because in the computer age, they have changed things now so that copying or forwarding or doing that sort of thing can be regarded as theft. So it's an area of law that I don't know enough about.
So I want to ask you one more thing, and then Elizabeth or George could please, if they'd like, and Margaret. When I met you out at your house in Berkeley a few weeks ago, we were talking about the grand jury that was impaneled in Boston to go after the New York Times reporters in the Pentagon reporting. So Nixon went right up to the edge and then he pulled back. But now Trump, you're saying, is already gone further, and will go still further. Could you tell that story? Yeah.
Yeah, Trump's is not the first to consider or pursue indicting a journalist. In fact, we now know that was true under Obama for a matter of years. They considered and considered and considered what they could possibly charge him with and whether it would stand up in court. And Obama drew back in the end in that they couldn't find a charge that was not unduly challenging or violating of the First Amendment and applying to all reporters. Now, they had this charge in hand. All the evidence was in their possession. So the Obama Department of Justice, which did want to indict Julian Assange and worked very hard to pursue that, decided that this was not sufficient grounds, perhaps that it was too flimsy a charge altogether, or that it would violate the First Amendment. But obviously, Trump is even less concerned about the First Amendment and the Constitution than our former constitutional lawyer president.
Yeah, George, can you ask Daniel that question you asked earlier?
Which one?
About? When whether there was a sealed indictment from 2010, and if Obama wasn't going to do it,
no,
if he had walked out, would he have been able to walk out? Yeah.
Exactly. In other words, was there a sealed indictment at any time during the Obama administration? So if at any time before January 2017, Julian Assange had walked out, would the Americans have then tried to extradite him?
By the way, an indication on that is that another consideration in not indicting him, this was in Michelle Goldberg's article that I just read, that another consideration was that they couldn't try him anyway, that it wasn't too much use for revealing the indictment because they didn't have him in their hands, because Ecuador, first under President Correa and then under Moreno, was not yet willing to turn him over. So what made Moreno, from when he first came into office, as a relatively liberal and leftist candidate, by the way, facing other candidates who said they would expel Julian Assange, the current president, Moreno, said he would not. That was his campaign. And when he first came in, it was after that, actually, that they made Julian an Ecuadorian citizen in hopes that he could get diplomatic immunity, and they would get him off their hands. They could send him out without the British arresting him. They also sought some assurance that Britain would not extradite him. And because actually under Ecuadorian law or practice, they can't extradite someone to a country that has the death penalty. That would seem to exclude the US. The US has the death penalty, but the British have probably given some assurance, for whatever it's worth, that the US will not seek the death penalty. I question, as a non-lawyer here, I'm a defendant, not a lawyer, but I question just how much that assurance by the British would be worth. Chelsea Manning was faced with charges which Assange has not yet been faced with, but could be faced with, that carried the death penalty. Their prosecutors said they would not seek the death penalty. But as people pointed out at the time, lawyers, that didn't prevent the judge, the single judge, she didn't have a jury, military judge, from deciding on the death penalty. Whatever the prosecutors sought, she's not limited. She was not limited by what the prosecutors sought. That could be true in this case. So in any case, they are sending it to a country that does have the death penalty.
I wanted to just repeat George's question. Since the Obama administration decided not to indict Assange, they gave up on this. Had he walked out of the embassy, would he have been basically just served a few months for his bail conditions and then be free because there was no indictment? Why would the U.S. have wanted him?
What I just said was that Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times just said, I don't know on what basis, but said that the consideration of the Obama administration probably was that they couldn't get at him. he had immunity. He was in Ecuador, and there was no use indicting him. Had he walked out, that would not have been true. Do I think that Obama would have taken the step under intelligence community pressure to get him, if they could get him in their hands? I would have to say yes, almost surely. After all, Obama, first saying that he would definitely put out photographs of torture that went beyond one prison and showed that it was a systematic practice, that it was a matter of high-level decision. Having said he would do that, he was induced by the intelligence community not to do that. After just a couple had come out, he backed off of that. And presidents in general don't like to buck the intelligence community. I must say Trump is an exception on that one. He's, for part of his term, he's been at war with the intelligence community as well. But in any case, I think Obama would not have just let Julian walk free. No.
Then they would have made up the indictment afterward. I mean, they didn't have any real indictment against him. That's what we're trying to figure out. If they didn't want to charge him.
Let's try it out. Or there were always people who said, use the Espionage Act as you've done it before. That wasn't unanimous that you by any means, that you couldn't do that. In fact, so I think absolutely, had he walked out before, they would have gotten him. And by the way, for years, there have been people saying, of all kinds, all stripes, left and right, saying, Julian is just staying in there because he's afraid of the Swedish indictment or for other reasons, and not because he's afraid of extradition. I was convinced from the beginning that extradition indictment was in fact what he was trying to avoid.
Absolutely. That's why he was given asylum. That's how he sought asylum. Right. It was not regarding the Swedish investigation specifically. It was to avoid, perceived threats of extradition and political persecution from the United States, for sure.
Right. And as we were saying earlier,
came out about a year ago, I believe, that for the first time, that the Swedes had been willing to interrogate him in prison, as they finally did for 4 hours without his lawyer present, but that they had been willing to do that earlier. That was always a puzzle because they had done that in the past. I assumed it was under U.S. pressure somehow that they rejected that idea. Well, it's come out now that the British, with or without U.S. pressure on that the British had been telling the Swedes they didn't want that to happen. And Britain, let's remember, is a country that does have an Official Secrets Act that covers journalists, which is our Espionage Act was not meant to be a British-type Official Secrets Act that criminalized any and all disclosure. Congress always rejected that when various administrations proposed it. We had a revolution. We have a First Amendment, actually, which Britain doesn't. But Britain prosecutes journalists regularly, and I'm sure they have no hesitation about regarding what Julian did as a crime, which it has never been regarded so far in the United States of America till now.
Well, is that right? I mean, didn't you explain once that, maybe even more than once, that in fact, in the United States, you can't have prior restraint. The government can't stop the publication of something. But once it is published, once you've published classified information, then the government can prosecute the journalist who did publish the classified information.
Yes, I explained that too many times. Because Section E, we talked about that, Dan. There is a section that mere possession and dissemination is a crime under the Espionage Act. This has never been used, even though Nixon tried it briefly.
It hasn't been used. And by the way,
it's like an Official
5 justices in the Supreme Court case, which was an injunction case for prior restraint. Of course, 6 voted of the 9 that they could not enjoin it for the information that was in the Pentagon Papers. They left open the possibility that there could be an injunction under some circumstances, but that the 7,000 pages of top secret documents, sensitive quote, that I put out didn't meet that standard for an injunction. However, 5 of them made obiter dicta in the course that criminal prosecution was possible. What they almost surely did not know, and I didn't know at the time, was that there never had been a criminal prosecution for that. There were leaks all the time, every day. The Times, in their editorial I saw just an hour ago, mentioned that the Times regularly put out classified information. And the link they gave to that was a very interesting column on my case, on the Pentagon Papers case, which I'd never seen before. I haven't even read it yet, but that's the one they chose. They do put out leaks before me and after me all the time, and often identify them as classified information. But in fact, what these judges said, of course you can prosecute, had never happened. And the reason for that wasn't that they didn't want to prosecute. The reason was that they felt the First Amendment forbade that, they being the Justice Department here and the administrations. So mine was an experiment to use the Espionage Act for the first time against someone giving information, not to a foreign power, not to an enemy, but to the American people. That was a first. So at that time, Melville Nimmer, that I mentioned earlier, who was the leading expert on law of information, copyrights, and other matters at that time, wrote a brief for the ACLU in my case, and then later a law article on it, very good still, saying that none of the charges against Daniel Ellsberg are constitutional. He said he should be acquitted, this is a slight paraphrase, he should be acquitted of all those charges, which included theft, not yet charged against Julian, although something like it, conspiracy, which he is charged with at this point, and the violations of the Espionage Act. So he said none of those by any previous president should be applied, and if they were so applied to a leaker, and if they were so applied, it's a direct quote, they would be found unconstitutional. And now, almost 50 years ago, that Supreme Court, almost surely a majority would have found those unconstitutional. And that's why they hadn't been previous cases and weren't any others until Samuel Loring Morrison, 10 years later, who was convicted and later pardoned after he'd served time in prison, some months in prison, for selective prosecution. Clinton pardoned him. And there was one other case against AIPAC brought, 3 before Obama. Then Obama brings 9. Not one of them has ever gone to the Supreme Court. Strictly speaking, Loring Morrison did appeal to the Supreme Court, but it was rejected. They didn't accept it and ruled on it. So the Supreme Court has never ruled on using the Espionage Act even against an official or a former official or a source, as the British thing. They have not tried. By the way, one last thing. The Espionage Act is worded in such a way as clearly to apply to a reporter just as much as to a source. In earlier days, they would have said it was overbroad, that even bringing that act using against a source like me, or an official like me, raised a law like that permitted it to be used against reporters was overbroad. But as I understand it, the doctrine of overbreadth has fallen into disuse lately. And they say, as long as we just narrowly apply it to somebody where it seems justified, and they claim an official, though that's never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court, the fact that it could be used to chill speech by threatening other people is not ground for throwing it out. I'm afraid that this Supreme Court, especially with the last couple of appointments, but even before that, appointments that were made, would be much less likely to find this unconstitutional. Their concern about constitutionality is not unlike Donald Trump's, and that's not something to rely on.
Dan, I have a question for you that I just want to ask really briefly. And Margaret, George, please answer this as well if you want to, if you can. And this is a bit speculative, but do you have any comments, thoughts, insights on what Assange is facing now that he is in custody and the way that, do you have any, comments on the way in which he may be treated differently from other prisoners given his situation?
Well, I'm assuming he'll be treated worse. And I think I've reached the conclusion that imprisonment is itself torture. I'm sure he's under solitary confinement. That's further torture. People like him have often been singled out when they're incarcerated, singled out by guards and so forth. So I believe his treatment will be very harsh. And but I want to go back to what I said previously. This is the time for people to put up or shut up about being in resistance, about calling this administration fascist, until he punishes someone who they've been told to hate. People have been propagandized into hating Julian Assange, mostly with lies. But to answer your question, yes, I think he will be treated very harshly. And these laws don't mean much when they want to get you. When they want to get you, they'll find a way, especially if the UN says they're about to send 2 rapporteurs to interview you, then they have to do the snatch before, was it April 25th, they were gonna speak to him. So
yes.
Of course,
and luckily, I mean, the UN rapporteur says that they're going to still investigate. They still want to speak with Assange. Now, whether that'll happen or not, who knows? But at least they're still going to try. I guess to refine my question a little bit, I guess the word torture comes to mind. I mean, we've discussed that phrase when it comes to Assange's isolation in the embassy for the last year or more. Do you think that phrase will be necessary to apply to his treatment in the future? And that's open to all of you as a question.
Were you asking me? I'm sorry.
Yes, and George.
I want to say there's one slight ray of sunlight in all this, and that is that Julian has been, in effect, tortured, but in any case subject to very great ill in the last several years because he's very strongly needed. He had some dental problems that needed care that could not be dealt with in the room in Ecuador or even in the consulate altogether, the embassy altogether. Moreover, he has very severe shoulder problems. I'm not aware of the details, but I do know that all of his friends felt that he needed an MRI and again, could not get that in Ecuador. So I would hope, and by the way, not only his friends, but the embassy there was trying to get an assurance from the British that he could be allowed to get medical attention without being arrested, since he was in a category of asylum. The British would never give that. If he goes out for his dental problems or for the shoulder problems, he'll be arrested right away. I would hope that one thing here would be now that as a prisoner, they would at least give him the medical attention that he's needed for some time. So
I guess, I wonder about that. I actually think that, I agree with Margaret. I think he's going to be treated worse than other prisoners. I don't think he's going to be given any books or anything to read. So in other words, not only is he in solitary confinement, he's got nothing to occupy his mind. He's got nothing to do. And I'm not at all sure about that he's going to get any, particularly good medical treatment. It's not going to be a great priority for him.
Well, especially considering that tooth was caused by his experience in prison, in UK prison.
Exactly. So. I think they're hostile to him, and they're not going to wheel in some fine doctors to attend to his shoulder and his teeth and so on. I tend to think that this is just guff for the press about how he's going to get first-rate medical treatment. I have serious doubts that that's going to happen.
And I recall what John Kiriakau said about his medical or lack of medical care when he was in prison. So I think that's more likely to be the case for Julian than not.
Well, Jeffrey Sterling definitely did not get, in his 30 months of confinement, medical treatment for heart problems that he actually had. That was a very severe worry. Chelsea Manning, of course, did not get various kinds of treatment that she needed for her transition in jail. Eventually, after a lot of public protest and organizational protest, she did get some. We're talking about very small mercies here. For example, right now, Chelsea Manning is in a women's jail, which is better, as her lawyer told me, it's better than being again in the male section, even after she'd transitioned. But all of this is a form of torture in a way. And by the way, this may sound like a joke, but it really isn't. In an effort specifically to coerce Julian to leave the embassy of his own free will without being dragged out forcibly by police, Moreno cut off his internet access. Now, for you, it's not really a joke to say that for Julian Assange, that is torture. That's close to the worst you can do. And unfortunately, a creature who lives by night on the internet and by day. So they cut that off. They cut off visitors. He didn't force him out, even after the Swedes had dropped their extradition request, because he always knew that the real extradition request was U.S. By the way, they tried to get an assurance from Sweden that he could be sent to Sweden on that without extradition to the United States. The Swedes would not give that assurance ever. But so why didn't he get out? Because his prospects now I would have to say the odds favor, even despite the resistance we must put up to extradition, which is not certain to fail. There may be effective international pressure not to extradite him on these charges or others. And again, if he goes before a jury with these charges by the U.S. government of conspiracy, and no doubt other charges as well, I think his chances nowadays of getting off or of having that on appeal will be very small. And that means, hard as it has been for him to be in one room with a computer most of the time, to be in jail where you don't have access to a computer or anything else, and as you said, very likely in solitary confinement on the grounds that he has still further secrets in his head that he must not communicate to others. That's why he got Mordecai Vanunu in isolation, strict solitary, for 10.5 years. I think it was 11.5 years out of the 18 that he spent in an Israeli jail for revealing that Israel had not only nuclear weapons, but probably thermonuclear weapons, which it had. So yes, none of these governments are above, in effect, torture to get their way, but it doesn't always work. And if I may make one disagreement from you, looking at you right now, saying that you said, who will be a whistleblower after this? Well, I could name them. Chelsea Manning would have been, Ed Snowden would be after this. They don't come along every day, unfortunately. And there will be others. I think James Risen would have gone to jail. Neil Sheehan would have gone to jail. But not so many other journalists. There are all too many journalists who will be content with accepting government handouts and printing them as they do most of the time in their dealings. And they won't count on classified scoops anymore. They'll just take what the government gives them openly in free press. And we'll have more Vietnams, more Iraqs, Somalia, Sudan, and so forth than before, than right now. It'll be worse than now in terms of intervention, and the arms race, the nuclear arms race, will continue unabated.
And there was a question from our technical director here about the Vanunu case. Mordecai Vanunu, of course, gave his story to the Sunday Times of London. What happened to the reporters at the Sunday Times of London? They published classified information. Nothing happened to them.
Well, that's true. They weren't tried. Classified information, but remember,
Israeli
it was Israel. Israel may be the 51st state. I don't think it's a district in England where it was printed. So these were secrets of the Israelis. By the way, a secret kept by every president till now. I even heard recently, couldn't have been from you, Joe, was it? Somebody told me recently that there actually was an agreement.
I told you this. I did tell you that. Yeah, huh? that was I was the one who told you that, because it was in this day-long conference at the press club here on the U.S. lobby, the Israel and the U.S. lobby, and someone in a speech said that every president is made or asked to sign a declaration they will not reveal this, and Trump signed it. That's what I was told. That's what this person
in other words, we keep their secrets from the American public. I think in part because, by the way, of the what is the act? The name of the act, anyway, that says you can't give aid, especially military aid, to a country that is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or that is
right.
Right. And so, to avoid that, each president gives the answer, "I don't know." He doesn't say, "I can't comment." It's a secret, an American secret. No, he says, "I don't know how many they have. Everybody else in the world knows, but not the president."
That was the first question Obama was asked at his very first press conference when he was first elected by Helen Thomas. The late Helen Thomas was a great journalist in the White House. She asked him, "Can you name a Middle East country that has a nuclear weapon?"
And what was his response?
He couldn't
name one. What did he say?
I don't remember the exact words, but he finessed out of that and said, "No, I just can't name one. I just can't think of one." Something like that. Got to look it up, the transcript of that.
Oh, I'll bet that. He wouldn't have said, "I can't tell you." That would raise a question, right?
Right. Let me see if I can find that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like Clapper, was asked, "Are we collecting hundreds of millions? Are we collecting calls on hundreds of millions of Americans, or in any way?" And Clapper said he decided that his least misleading answer would be no. He said no. Now, that was a total lie, as Snowden revealed within weeks or months to the Intelligence Committee. His least misleading answer, it would be hard to know a more misleading answer. But if he'd said, I can't tell you that, we have to go into closed session, that would have hinted at the answer. So he meant the least informational answer I can give you is no.
Because if you say no, you don't quite know what it is you're saying no to, because there might be various components to the question. He might be saying no to one of them.
Given to him earlier, and the question was very broad. It was by, I believe, Ron Wyden, Senator, who advised this person to say, in any way, for any purpose, are you collecting files on hundreds of millions, which they were. And in this case, Snowden showed documents, electronic files in this case. Had he not done that, who would have believed him? Who could believe that who would believe that George W. Bush saying we don't collect anything on American citizens without a warrant? Who could believe that he was lying when he said that? Well, you could say, well, he's president, isn't he probably lying? But people had not reached that point. And I'm sorry to say they hadn't even yet, except Trump, where it's so regular, they say, well, of course he's lying, he's talking.
And Clapper hasn't been charged with perjury, has he?
I'm sorry?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Clapper has not been charged with perjury, has he?
Yeah. Well,
no, he hasn't.
I'm being sarcastic. Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course he has.
That double standard is just too constant, We just see it over and over again.
Excuse me, I found the answer to what Obama said, and you never guessed the publication. I found it, and I looked through several of them. Consortium News, an article by Bob Perry, and Obama stumbled in response, saying he didn't want to speculate. That's what he said.
That's very good. I won't want to speculate on whether my CIA reports are correct or not.
I have a question. Is Julian getting any visitors? Does anyone know?
Yeah, Jen Robinson, his lawyer, saw him yesterday.
Uh-huh.
So his lawyers are allowed in. I don't know about anybody else.
His family, no?
He doesn't really have family in the UK right now, no. But we'll see.
I think wasn't his mother there recently, just outside the embassy, I believe, Christine. I thought I heard that she was present.
Recently?
Not when he was arrested, but just before that.
I don't know that for sure.
I haven't heard that, but
his father was there at Christmas. I know that, but I don't know.
I visited him a couple of times in the embassy, and
now tell me, Dan, when you saw him compared to what he looked like when he was taken out.
Oh, I don't know when he wasn't bearded in that way when I saw him, but I will say now that he looked terrible the last time I visited him. I was really very worried about it. He'd really gone downhill. He looked very sallow. He has white hair anyway, but fairly fair skin. He looked bad. The lack of sunlight for 7 years, and he has a sun lamp, but I would have thought it did more for him, but he didn't look good. Whereas the first time I saw him he seemed quite together. It was a big difference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as we said earlier, that was really an example of documenting the slow effect of that torture on Assange in the embassy that we've been talking about for months and months and months at Unity 4J, and other supporters of Assange have talked about endlessly. But that image of him being brought out really was us witnessing the effect of that torture. So.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we've gone over. Go ahead, Margaret. We've gone over 32 minutes, but I don't want to end it if we're not finished.
Sure, I just wanted to know what the next steps are legally. What is the next thing that's supposed to happen?
Well, they said the lawyers are going to resist the extradition. And I was surprised to see in the papers today that they were saying that could take a long time, even years. So that means a British jail rather than an American jail. And I can't judge what the difference might be. It'll be not good. I am, you know, when you say it's not guaranteed at all that he'll get the medical attention he needs, you know, they could treat him worse. But, you know, if he was another prisoner, I'm sure in his condition, he would get medical help from Britain. I give him that much credit. Will he get it? If he doesn't get it, the British should be held very much to account for that. I mean, it's well known that they have a prisoner now who has not seen the sun for 7 years, but who has various medical conditions that have not been treated because the British would not permit him to get out of there without being arrested. So he certainly needs that attention. He deserves it. And we'll see whether the British give it. But if they don't, they should be held to account to the extent possible.
His lawyers will make that known for sure, that he has not getting the treatment. And that will not look good for the British yet.
Yeah.
But depends how much they care. Right, George? They don't really care, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think they do. I don't think they do. I think they're hostile to him, and yes. they're not going to go to any trouble to look after him. So, you know, he'll get some attention.
The eye of the world. The eye of the world is on them on this, unlike the usual prisoner. And granted that a lot of people, actually, Michelle Goldberg said, in my opinion, inexcusably, but he deserves what he's getting, which is life in prison here. And she named several things, by the way, which, if they were true, would be just cause for criticizing him or even condemning him, but not legally. Take a look at her column and see whether the things she describes in there are violations of law. You know, I would say if they're true, definitely would be worthy of criticism or condemnation on that. And I don't know whether they're true.
Well, this level of vitriol is just, it's horrible. That people who should know better have targeted him with it, have leveled at him. The court of public opinion has been poisoned against him. Journalists who ought to know better, who ought to know to defend him regardless of their personal opinions about anything he said or done. It's just very, very disappointing to see. And that she's not the only one. I've been shocked by the ignorance, the willful ignorance of people who don't even seem to want to be curious or to want to investigate and see if what they've been told is true is very sad to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, by the way, the things that Michelle Goldberg was talking about, she put to one side the things that could be charged, that he's charged with against every journalist. So things that could be charged against her or her colleagues, she said, okay, she didn't say he should go to prison for that. She did say he should be in jail forever for doing various other things, which I say, look again and see whether they're breaking the law. And she was willing to call him odious, for example, based on what knowledge? The Times did not refrain from mentioning that he looked scraggly when he was dragged out of prison. And his beard was shaggy. Do they say that about, is that an adjective that just goes with being bearded? I see I'm looking at a very neat beard at this moment. But
well, a lot of this hatred is because Trump won.
George's beard is very neat. But what would they have said about him? Well, if he was Assange, the Times would say about him, trying to look like a bohemian poet. Something like that about George.
Yes. No, I'm sure that's right. But in fact, the Times did say, I mean, when who was that editor? I've forgotten his name. You know, the one before last, who wrote about how he smelled. He made the point about how Julian Assange.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't kind of publish that.
Yeah, he'd been, he'd been on the run for I don't know how long. You know, too bad he just didn't have a time to have a shower. You know, well, he smelled. You know, I just he found that unpleasant odor that emanated. I mean, it's. I mean,
he's not one of us. Bill Keller wanted to say
sheer lack of imagination on the part.
I recognize. Well, no, they wouldn't have allowed that in the Times newsroom. Although Carl Bernstein was sometimes criticized for that sort of thing, but he overwhelmed them in the end.
You know, the Economist magazine, under the headline, Julian Assange, journalistic hero or enemy agent, and the subheadline, dumping unredacted information is the act of a useful idiot, not a journalist. They used the word hirsute. I have to admit, a word I've not seen before in English language. Julian Assange hauled out of the Ecuadorian embassy on April 11th after 7 years of self-imposed confinement, pale and hirsute. You know this word, Dan? Hirsute. Was not a pleasant house guest. He's alleged to have smeared feces on the wall of the embassy and neglected his cat, among other uncouth behavior. That's how the Economist, this columnist in the Economist, began his article. And the word hirsute is defined as hairy, shaggy, bushy, hair-covered, long-haired, woolly, furry, fleecy, fuzzy, etc. So I was hoping that we might see more reporters realizing the issues that could affect them. And maybe that'll come if these new indictments do go closer over the line or over the line totally. But
by the way, so far, public protests can have a difference, at least in the conditions there. The only reason that Chelsea Manning got out of solitary confinement in Quantico, where, by the way, just add something to that, forced to stand naked as a man for inspection in the time, kept from sleeping a great deal. But anyway, in solitary confinement for 10.5 months. And the only reason that did that was that a lot of people got arrested protesting her confinement and protest in general. And finally, they let her into the general population. My friend Mordecai Vanunu, 10.5 years, that did have an effect on him. 10.5 months, 10.5 weeks can do that. And he was there for 10.5 years. And it definitely affected his mental balance at that time until he got into the general prison population. And then those symptoms went away, essentially, and had gone away by the time I met him. In this very case, Chelsea, again, was held in solitary confinement. I think it was for 25 days, something like that. And the only reason she got out was that various of his supporters encouraged organizations to protest on that. And they claimed, by the way, that it was not solitary. This is just recently, now going on right now. They said, no, she's not in solitary. She's in administrative segregation. And actually, although she was held in her cell 22 hours a day, she was allowed out for 3 hours a day from 1 to 4 a.m. But that's not solitary confinement. She could go to the library. She could do whatever she wanted at 1 o'clock in the morning. So the protest did get her out of that. So when it comes to things like medical attention or even solitary confinement, actually we've seen that public protests can have an effect. And let's do it.
I think that's really encouraging. And I think it's not a sense of false optimism that you're bringing up, like the potential effect that support can have and that protests, shows of solidarity, vigils can have. I think that I hope will empower the listeners and viewers to get out there and show up and do something.
Absolutely. We certainly weren't going to do that. We didn't do all of this for nothing, did we?
Exactly.
Especially those of you, Joe and Elizabeth and Susie and others who worked so hard. We didn't do this for nothing. And we knew this was a possibility, and I'm sure no one intends to stop because the story is not over.
We're going to be here for years as this extradition works out.
Well,
we will be here.
I want to congratulate you again. These vigils and the other attention he's gotten from people who have not been led to despise him personally or to attack him personally, but to show the interest in it and the concern by a lot of people that you show on these vigils, I think have almost surely contributed to his staying in the Ecuador embassy instead of in a cell, obviously without a computer, for many months. Why did it happen just now? Well, $10 billion for Moreno overrode his concerns about public criticism. And by the way, I understand he's getting a lot of criticism in Latin America for truckling to the US now, which is never popular in Latin America. He is, by the way, facing charges of corruption right at this time, and which he says WikiLeaks contributed to. This is a case where WikiLeaks has not taken credit for that. They've said they did not reveal those leaks. I don't know whether Moreno has a basis for that or not. Certainly Assange doesn't make a habit, naturally, like any journalist, of telling who his sources are. But in this case, he said, no, we didn't reveal that. But he did retweet charges against Moreno just recently, which infuriated him,
WikiLeaks did.
showing that he knew that he was under this kind of threat all this time, but he's not a guy that is easily intimidated.
Right, yeah, but Assange had not had access to the internet for over a year, and the protocol that was, imposed on him without his consent was not imposed on the WikiLeaks Twitter account, which is not being run by him. The WikiLeaks Twitter account did retweet news on the INA paper scandal, but it wasn't Assange, and so really, it seems like Moreno was trying to simply deflect that scandal into a way to bring up WikiLeaks, blame WikiLeaks, and to get the attention off of himself. More than anything.
But Julian should surely have told WikiLeaks in his own interest of staying there cool-it on Moreno here for a while. He obviously did not do that.
Yeah. I guess maybe they didn't really, because it seems to be such a stretch to apply that protocol to the WikiLeaks Twitter account and to claim that retweeting an article about the scandal would be misconstruing that as leaking and publishing. I mean, it was really bizarre, the allegations.
Moreno mentioned, by the way, leaks or things that WikiLeaks had published recently, and he attributed responsibility to Julian about the Vatican. Now, I missed those. Does anybody know what it was that he came out about the Vatican?
I have a vague recollection that it was about something related to the Knights of Malta. Is that right, Joe? Do you remember that?
Yes, yeah. It's related to the Knights of Malta, but that's all I recall too. I confess I did not delve into those. I'd like to, though. In terms about the timing, Dan, the day before he was arrested, WikiLeaks had a press conference and revealed to the world that Assange had been surveilled in a very intrusive way, including when he was being examined by his doctor in the embassy and meetings with lawyers, and that a legal document that was left behind briefly by one of his lawyers was copied by a staff member of the embassy, presumably. And all of this came about because somebody who had access to that surveillance gave it to a bunch of criminals down in Spain who were trying to extort 3 million euros from WikiLeaks to keep these documents from this surveillance stuff from being made public. So the next day he gets arrested.
Okay.
Yeah. They really made Ecuador look pretty bad right there for that. That made the front pages, according to our reporter down there, Jose Rivera, that made the front pages of even the Ecuadorian newspapers that are pretty much under the control of the government for the most part, from what he tells us. Mm-hmm. So that was a great embarrassment. And it also took place a week or so after Julian told the ambassador, was told by the ambassador, shut up, because Julian had called him an agent of the United States. So things were coming to a head, clearly. Mm-hmm. And I, as far as the timing goes, you'd have to think that maybe this scandal about the surveillance of Julian, including breaking attorney-client privilege, may have had something to do with the timing. And those cops were out there we were on vigil last week. So this was a Friday. Last Friday is when WikiLeaks said that he was imminently going to be arrested. And you saw all these police cars there and uncovered cops and somebody with their head covered sitting in a car outside. It appeared that they were either intimidating him or they were waiting for an order to go in.
And when that April the 25th, then Joe, when that April the 25th meeting was to take place with the rapporteurs on torture and privacy, and what were they going to say? I mean, on this information about that they're looking in on medical examinations, that they're looking in on legal documents, wiretapping.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
that was the rapporteur on privacy rights, as well as the rapporteur on. Right.
Right. So they would issue a really damning report on that.
But they still might issue that report. They're still going to do their work, apparently, as Elizabeth tells us. And now that they have the evidence of this extortion scheme that revealed the extent of the surveillance, which went as far as, when he was getting examined by a doctor and speaking with his lawyers.
Yeah.
Well, I can't prove that the following thing involved surveillance, but I assumed it did at the time. The second time I went there to see him, we were informed at the embassy that he was not getting visitors. He could not have visitors in the regular hours that he'd been assigned before. There was a new ambassador there, was not friendly to him as the previous one had been, and had suddenly cut off all visitors. They had to be very special, only his lawyers or something. So I went off that evening, and I was staying with one of his supporters, and I called deliberately on his supporter's line. I think it was Vaughn Smith. No, it was, I'm sorry, it was one of his top supporters who died a few years ago. But I said over the phone, tomorrow I'm going to go and I'm going to lie in front of there were policemen, of course, right in the foyer, right outside the door, 2 policemen, and other policemen watching at several levels across the street to see if he jumped from his balcony or he tried to get away anyway. So we'd been past these police already, were rather friendly to us. And I said, I'm going to be lying in front of that door. Nobody can come in or out except over my body unless I'm arrested, unless they agree to let us come in, which they had refused to do and said we would not be able to do. So I said that over this phone, which I took for granted was one of the more surveilled phones in the British Isles at that point. And lo and behold, we went the next morning there, expecting actually that I would have to do this. And we told some press, to be there. It might be something interesting that morning. And we were allowed in. The thing had been lifted, no explanation given, whatever. We got in to see Julian, have lunch with him and so forth. So I took it for granted that was one case where I was communicating with the authorities, I could say indirectly, but actually pretty directly. And they decided not to evidence it.
It worked. Yeah.
Anyway, listen, I've got some people upstairs, I think, talking about Julian who've been waiting here for a minute.
Well, I appreciate your time, Deb. We went way over time, and it was really great to have you again with us.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to all of you for doing it.
Thank you for joining us.
It's far from over yet, and there's a lot to do. So thank you for doing it. Bye.
All the best, Dan.
Thank you.
So, Elizabeth, I think we could end this vigil that went over almost an hour. And I thank everybody who joined us, Peter and Michel Colon in Brussels, and George. You're in New York, George?
Yes.
Samueli, I know how to say his last name now. Samueli. Okay. He's in New York, and Elizabeth in Arkansas.
Yep.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. See you next Friday. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Same time, same place.
See you all then.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.